For the curious amongst you, that clip was from 2019's Pet Sematary, based upon Stephen King's 1983 novel of the same name, which, for those of you that have read it, will know that it's one of King's most despairing of tales, and also that movie got quite a bit of stick, but hey, I thought it was pretty good. Also, interestingly enough, King's adaptation decided to flesh out the age-old tale of the ancient burial ground of legend by pairing it with the spirit of the Wendigo, which is telling to modern fiction's interpretation of the Wendigo myth, but as we're about to find out, there is far more to it than an antler-bound revenant of the dead. To first understand a creature or a concept, perhaps our first port of call should be the etymology behind it. The definition of the term Wendigo is a key part of the oral traditions of the indigenous people of North America, and well, that's where we first find our first problem, because as we will quickly find, there are many different ways to portray the word Wendigo. In the Ojibwe language, it is the windigo. In the language of the Algonquin people, it is wujigo. In the Cree, it is the wikitau. And in the Proto-Algonquin of the Algic, it is wi neketo wa, which most likely translated to owl in their original language. And this is where it is difficult to pinpoint the exact origin of the concept, or whether there even was an origin point, and the Wendigo instead emerged into the psyche of the indigenous people of North America through a shared sense of moral obligation, or even stranger still, the same shared experiences. That though is pure speculation, but interestingly enough, there is a similar word, the wuge, that depicts a similar being that appears in the legends of the Athabascan people of the northwest Pacific coast. You see, much like the Wendigo, the wuge is a man-eating creature that devours flesh as a curse and eternal punishment. But interestingly, the wuge of legend is instead inexplicably tied to the creation mythos of a specific group of Athabascan people, the Danija, which roughly translate to those who live among the beaver, who believe that in their mythology the wuge was a person who would become possessed or overwhelmed by the power of one of the ancient giant spirit animals that form the basis of their oral tradition. In most instances, the wuge is depicted as a creature formed of ice and can only be killed by being thrown into a campfire and kept there overnight until it has melted. In some instances, however, this creature is even depicted as having wings, a rare occurrence in the traditions of North American legend and a symbol of great importance. Whichever depiction of the Wendigo myth we take though, one thing is for certain. In the traditional belief systems of the Ojibwe, the Saulteaux, the Cree, the Naskapi, the Innu, and many other Algonquin-speaking peoples of North America, the Wendigo is far more than just a cautionary tale told to children over a campfire. It is an integral part of their complex belief system, and in most cases it served as a taboo reinforcement, both a reminder and a warning of the hardships faced through winter. No matter which depiction of the myth we pull apart, in each of them the Wendigo is seen as the embodiment of gluttony and greed, particularly in relation to the unbreakable taboo of cannibalism. It is a cultural cornerstone, a warning sign of excess in consumption, and the creature that would later form these warning signs would become the embodiment of that. Now, that is not to say that the depiction of the Wendigo was always the same. In some cases, particularly in regard to Ojibwe and Cree lore, the Wendigo was often described as a giant creature, many times larger than a human being, a differing characteristic that was absent from other Wendigo myths of Algonquin culture. In these legends, whenever a Wendigo would consume another person, it would grow larger in proportion to the meal it had just eaten, preventing it from ever sating its own hunger. It always wanted more, never sated or content with its quarry. That's an important lesson for all of us to learn, I think. But still, this led to the garish and oftentimes terrifying description of this creature that would later become the driving force behind its evolution from the 20th century onwards, particularly when we analyse its depiction in modern horror fiction. As Basil H. Johnson, an Ojibwe teacher and scholar from Ontario, described in his 1995 book The Manitous, the Spirit World of the Ojibwe, the Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones. With its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash grey of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets, the Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, unclean and suffering from suppuration of the flesh. The Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odour of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. And this is where the modern depiction of the Wendigo gained traction as an entity of horror fiction. The Wendigo is terrifying, a humanoid supernatural creature that exemplified an eternal hunger, and as European settlers made their way through North America and the colonial period of the continent began to tighten its grip around this ancient culture, the modern interpretation of the Wendigo was born. And not only that, but as science and psychology came face to face with ancient oral traditions, the exact concept of the Wendigo's cultural purpose became something else entirely. Wendigo psychosis, a historical phenomenon that is perhaps the reason why the Wendigo myth was so successful in later North American literature. In 1661, as a chronicler and missionary for the Jesuit relations made their way through North America, they came across the first documented account of Wendigo psychosis as a result of a reported case of desperation and cannibalism. As he explained, the men that he came across were afflicted with neither lunacy, hypochondria, nor frenzy, but a combination of all of these species of disease, which affects their imaginations and causes them a more than canine hunger. This makes them so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men like veritable werewolves and devour them voraciously without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more greedily, the more they eat. Whatever the interpretation of this report, it was an important moment in the later cultural significance of the Wendigo, particularly with its relation as a genuine concern for the rough and often inhospitable periods in colonial North American history. Now, the Wendigo was far more than just a creature in a far-off land, but instead a very real hardship faced in winter as the inexperienced fur trappers and settlers pushed further into the New World, hearing tales from the indigenous peoples of the land who had grew to fear it over many generations. However, one of the more famous cases of Wendigo psychosis came several hundred years later with the tale of a Plains Cree trapper named Swift Runner. During the harsh winter of 1878, Swift Runner and his family were stranded and starving in the wilderness of Saskatchewan. Soon, despite being 25 miles away from an emergency food cache of the Hudson's Bay Company, Swift Runner's eldest son perished, and shortly afterward, Swift Runner allegedly butchered and ate his wife and 5 remaining children. The case was both strange and shocking, and given that the Plains Cree trapper resorted to cannibalism in such close proximity to the emergency cache, it was later revealed that Swift Runner's actions were not the case of pure cannibalism as a dark and last resort to starvation, but rather of a man afflicted by Wendigo psychosis. And here was the inspiration for the first and very important fictional interpretation of the Wendigo myth, with a short story written by Algernon Blackwood, a tale written in the year 1910 simply titled The Wendigo, the first mainstream horror depiction of its kind. In the story, Blackwood tells the tale of 2 Scotsmen on a moose hunting trip in the wilderness of Rat Portage in northwest Ontario. They are joined on their trip by 2 guides, a man named Hank Davis and the French Canuck Joseph Defargo, alongside their native cook, a man named Punk. Although this tale is a very tame brush with the Wendigo myth of legend compared to most modern incarnations, it instead employed the first depiction of the Wendigo not just as a grotesque entity, but instead as a doppelganger which could take on the guise of a human being. Perhaps the most important convention of this story, though, is with the wisdom of the native character Punk, who recognizes all of the signs of the Wendigo and immediately gets the hell out of camp. Whatever its importance to the mainstream horror depiction of the Wendigo, Algernon Blackwood's story planted the seed of an idea in many other horror writers of the time. It would influence authors such as Howard Phillips Lovecraft and Grace Isabel Colburn, and most importantly, Auguste Derleth, who would use the concept of the Wendigo in his story, The Thing That Walked on the Wind, and later with his Cthulhu mythos entity, Ithaqua, which some of you may be familiar with. Hint, it's a giant Wendigo-looking ice revenant that roams the Arctic wastes. Sound familiar? Yeah. It would also go on to inspire an early short story of Thomas Pynchon's titled Mortality and Mercy in Vienna, first published in 1959. Here it focused on a character developing Wendigo psychosis and his development then into a psychotic serial killer. That in itself would later inspire several movies such as 1999's Ravenous, as well as several TV series such as Charmed and more recently Hannibal. Perhaps the most iconic of the modern Wendigo, though, is with Stephen King's version of the entity. As we briefly explained in our opening clip, it would inspire a key character in King's 1983 novel Pet Sematary, where the personification of evil in an ancient burial ground of the Micmac people was an ugly, grinning creature with yellow-grey eyes, its ears replaced by ram's horns, and its tongue pointed, decaying, and yellowed. Although not as profound as it is now, at the time, King's interpretation of the Wendigo, which in turn was an interpretation of the 19th century colonial legends coming from North America, set the template for the Wendigo's later portrayal in popular Hollywood horror culture, where for the most part it completely replaced the Native American lore that had long formed the importance of the Wendigo. In 2012 though, Chippewa author Louise Erdrich had a thing or two to say about that with her novel The Roundhouse, setting the precedent for the new reinterpretation of the Wendigo myth. And here is where our path splits, because the Wendigo in many ways explains the transformation of one land to the other. For thousands of years the Wendigo served as a cultural barometer for the Algonquian people, an ever-adapting tale that formed the importance of cooperation, of restraint, of sustainability, and the dangers that came with forsaking those virtues. It painted the monster that we all ran the risk of becoming if we indulged too much in the act of greed. You see, as colonial North America expanded into these ancient territories and these settlers shifted away from the many European folk tales that had formed the basis of their society, new ones were forged, fragments of a culture that had long existed before them as they clambered to produce some sort of an identity. Whilst this identity has been interpreted in many differing ways, perhaps in most cases to their detriment, the essence behind the myth of the Wendigo has always remained the same. Be it man or monster, we all choose which side we fall on.
Coming in at number 5, we've got the Stalker Challenge. Right on, you might hear that name and think it's one thing, but it's actually probably not the first conclusion your mind lands upon. The Stalker Challenge isn't about following someone around or testing a pal's skills at going unnoticed in the dark. It's actually a reference to a popular PC game called Stalker, where players explore an alternate reality Chernobyl exclusion zone. A lot of folks praise it for its lonesome and isolated atmosphere and the more realistic gunplay. Plenty of online military enthusiasts, survivalists, and Tarkovsky fans enjoy the game, so when we say that this Wendigo sighting was a result of the Stalker Challenge, we can probably assume the writer was a fan of Stalker and wanted to experience living life solo in the wastelands for a while. During this temporary hermitage, he worked his way into the middle of nowhere with nothing but some vodka, guns, and a harmonica. Like a true survivalist, he hunted some small game, made a meal of it, and explored the surrounding area. Snacking on the rabbit he'd hunted, he heard some rustling coming from the bushes, but didn't think anything of it. The next day, he was startled awake by some screaming. Weird, especially considering how far he was from civilization. Grabbing his rifle, he went off in the direction of the scream. It didn't seem to come from one singular location, and eventually the writer got lost. After a long day wandering around, he found his way back to the camp he'd set up, but now somebody else was there. There was a humanoid form in tattered clothes staring down at his fire pit, unmoving. Worried that this person might be injured, the writer called out to him. No response. After a few minutes of standing there staring at him, he again asked if he was alright. The humanoid figure turned to him and said, "I wouldn't worry about it." This set off alarm bells for the writer, who began to back away. At that point, the humanoid mentioned that he could go for another meal right now, prompting the writer to book it out of there. Hearing the humanoid running behind him, he turned around and shot blindly, apparently finding his mark. The creature screamed, the same scream from earlier, and seemingly disappeared. The writer eventually made it to the road and encountered a car. He didn't look back. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Nebraskan Wendigo. If you weren't already wary of traveling alone in Nebraska, now you've got a whole new reason. That's right, a new spooky story of someone's close encounter with a third kind. Maybe not an alien, but hey. This tale comes from a guy who was a farmhand when he was younger. One night, the farmer he worked for asked if he could figure out who was trampling all the corn stalks at night. Excited to take on guard duty, the farmhand stayed up to see if he could catch the culprit. Armed with the farmer's shotgun and the advice not to shoot unless absolutely necessary, he hung out in a lawn chair and walked around the field a few times. Eventually, he heard rustling from within the cornfield, followed by what sounded like giggling children. This, of course, was the most unsettling moment of the farmhand's entire life. Not wanting to hurt kids, but also not wanting to get children of the corn, he brandished his gun and told them to leave unless they were looking for trouble. The giggling stopped and the rest of the night went smoothly. However, the next morning the farmer discovered something a little more disturbing than trampled corn. His cow, which had been left in the barn, was totally exsanguinated. All the blood in this animal was removed somehow and didn't leave any on the floors. The farmer called the cops and somehow managed to land on the explanation that it was some idiot kids, but the farmhand didn't quite buy that. However, the following night both the farmer and the farmhand stayed up to see if they could find anyone. The farmhand, sitting in his chair again, heard the giggling once more. This time he asked whoever it was to reveal himself, prompting a gigantic humanoid creature with antlers to shuffle out of the field. Bad call, to be honest. The farmhand shot at the beast and began to run away. During his flight, he was tripped by a gopher hole and fell to the ground hard. Suddenly it was morning and the farmhand was back inside the house, surrounded by the farmer's family. The farmer had told the cops that he was attacked by some random guy, but he chased him off. However, afterwards, the farmer took the farmhand aside and told him that he saw the beast too. It was on all fours after the boy tripped, and it took 6 shots from his rifle to scare it off. From then on, they didn't go out after dusk, and they kept guns on them at all times around the farm. Coming in at number 3, we've got Pet Sematary. If you've only seen the movies based on this Stephen King tale, you might be a little confused. The feature films tend to skim over the folklore at the core of this resurrectory story. Sure, the ground is soured and stuff comes back to life, but why? Well, if you crack open a spicy little paperback, you'll find out exactly what happens. The spirit of a Wendigo plays a big part. The Creeds move into a lovely home near Ludlow and immediately run into trouble. The kids are getting hurt and the cat is killed by a passing vehicle. And soon enough, they learn about the Micmac burial ground near their residence. Apparently, it was abandoned because the ground was sour. Soon they learn some tales detailing the Wendigo that lived around there. It would walk through villages late at night, and anyone touched by it would develop a taste for human flesh. Eventually, it touched the burial ground itself, souring it and causing anything buried there to be possessed by it. This Wendigo spirit seems to orchestrate all sorts of terrible events in the story, playing with the emotions of the people around the Creed house. Some say that the Wendigo even manipulates the grief of everyone in the tale, causing them to act against their better judgment. Through this, it can possess more people and cause more terror. The horror of the Wendigo runs deeper than just the hunger for flesh and physical strength. Coming in at number 2, we've got Wendigo Psychosis. There is some debate as to whether this disorder is real or not. If you look to the origins of the Wendigo legend, you can find plenty of association with the depths of winter. Without readily available food, often First Nations people would be subjected to famine. One who would indulge in the taboo of human flesh was considered to be possessed by an evil spirit, one that would never be satisfied. It makes sense, right? The idea of a cautionary tale involving a slippery slope existing everywhere. One slip up and you can descend into the depths of depravity. This seemed to be where the Wendigo legend originates, and since then the Wendigo name has been used to denote a mental illness. Wendigo psychosis is said to be the uncontrollable craving for human flesh, even if other options are available. Often reported in the northeastern American tribes, it started to die out once folks began to study and write about it. This caused a lot of folks to become skeptical, but the idea lived on. Plenty of tales concerning this sudden cannibalism have turned up over the years, and whether an actual Wendigo spirit has possessed these individuals or if they're just experiencing a psychotic break is hard to say. There's an account from some Jesuit missionaries traveling through New France back in the 19th century, where they came across some men with the mysterious psychosis. Keep in mind, these missionaries were likely deliberately painting any First Nations peoples as savages in need of religion, so maybe take this with a grain of salt. They claimed in their report that they met men so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men like veritable werewolves, and devour them voraciously without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more greedily the more they eat. I mean, that does sound like a Wendigo, doesn't it? And coming in at number 1, we've got Swift Runner. This is a man who claimed to have been possessed by a Wendigo. It seems that he was generally well liked in his community. A Cree man, he was a tour guide that assisted visitors. In the late 1870s, he and his family moved into the woods. Unseen from the winter of 1878 until the spring of 79, the man came back and claimed that his family succumbed to starvation during the harsh winter. He did not look worse for wear though. Suspicious of the supposedly starving man, folks went to find his campsite, and when they got there, they were horrified to discover human bones, picked clean and hollowed out. There was even a skull with a shoe in it. After this, Swift Runner admitted to cannibalizing his family. Didn't appear to be totally necessary either. There were posts nearby that they could have used to get supplies, and the option to return to the community was still on the table. The answer to whether a Wendigo spirit had actually overtaken him died with him though, as he was hanged for his transgressions.
Now, I could go about this by finding alleged sightings and claiming that the government tried to hide them, but I think it will make for a more interesting video if I explore the various meanings and interpretations of the legend, and then bring it back to the government's attempts to hide this information at the end. I've done my best to make sure my research is accurate, but obviously, this is not a story from my culture, and I may get some of the details wrong. So if you're a member of a tribe whose folklore we're exploring, please feel free to leave corrections or clarifications in the comments below. With that in mind, let's begin our journey. Starting with number 5, the literal legend. The Wendigo story has some variation between tribes, but most of the general details are the same. My research has shown that some tribes believe that the very first Wendigo was a warrior who made a deal with an evil spirit in exchange for the skills, strength, and stature to defeat his foes and save his tribe. He was transformed into the Wendigo, and after the battle was banished by his people. Wendigo is a malevolent spirit who possesses people, with some versions of the tale having this be a result of a person's greed, and others having a more disturbing cause. A common version of the legend is that when people are caught in times of famine or in extreme survival situations, they sometimes have to resort to eating human flesh in order to survive. This resulted in them transforming into a Wendigo, who would have an intense craving for human flesh that could never be satiated, no matter how much they consumed. Some tribes describe the Wendigo as a creature who grows with every person they eat so that they can never be full, making them simultaneously starving and gluttonous. In his book The Manitus, The Spiritual World of the Ojibwe, First Nations teacher and scholar Basil H. Johnston gives the following physical description of the creature. The Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones. With its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets. The Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, unclean and suffering from the suppuration of the flesh. The Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odor of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. Wendigo's level of cunning in speech vary from version to version, with some tales having him imitate the voice of a loved one in order to coax their victims closer. A particularly disturbing folk story that was part of the compilation of tales assembled by a scholar named Lottie Marsden in Ojibwe Myths and Tales Archaeological Report of the Canadian Institute goes as follows. One time long ago, a big Wendigo stole a boy. But the boy was too thin, so the Wendigo didn't eat him up right away. But he traveled with the boy, waiting for him to get fat. The Wendigo had a knife and he'd cut the boy on the hand to see if he was fat enough to eat. But the boy didn't get fat. They traveled too much. One day they came to a village and the Wendigo sent the boy to the village to get some things for him to eat. He just gave the boy so much time to go there and back. The boy told the tribe that the Wendigo was near them, and showed them his hand where the Wendigo cut him to see if he was fat enough to eat. They heard the Wendigo calling the boy. He said to the boy, "Hurry up, don't tell lies to those people." The tribe went to where the Wendigo was and cut off his legs. They went back again to see if he was dead. He wasn't. He was eating the marrow from inside of the bones of his legs that were cut off. The tribe asked the Wendigo if there was any fat on them. He said, "You bet there is. I've eaten lots of you. No wonder they are so fat." Then they killed him and cut him to pieces. This was the end of this giant Wendigo. Number 4. The purpose of the legend. Whether the native people believe in the Wendigo as a literal creature or merely as a legend depends entirely on the individual's beliefs and who you ask, and it's frankly really not for me to say. There are certainly a significant number of believers who report sightings, but for the purpose of this entry on the list, let's look at the Wendigo from the perspective that it's a folk legend that was created and passed down for a purpose beyond "look out, snow monster!" Many scholars believe that the Wendigo was created as a cautionary tale and a deterrent. As any Canadian will tell you, the winters here can be long and brutal. This would result in hunting parties being trapped in storms and there being extreme food shortages. In such extreme survival situations, it would not be uncommon for people in their desperation to consider eating members of their community in a last-ditch effort to survive. This was considered extremely taboo, obviously, and the prevailing idea was that in these situations it was the proper response to face famine with resignation and a readiness for death. This lends credence to the idea that the legend was created as a deterrent and a cautionary tale to prevent members of the tribe from eating each other during the long, brutal winters, telling them that indulging in the consumption of human flesh would transform them into a hideous and ravenous monster who would be hungry forever. Some have suggested that the Wendigo's appearance is a reference to the harsh elements of the winter, with their emaciation being reminiscent of the hunger winter caused and their tattered and bloody lips being reminiscent of the enduring ravages of frostbite. If the tribe believed that someone could also be transformed into a Wendigo due to greed, what better way to deter it than to tell the greedy party to shape up so that they could avoid turning into a Wendigo? The taboo against Wendigo-like actions were so strong that during times of famine, tribes, such as the Assiniboine, the Cree, and the Ojibwe, would reinforce the supposed dangers with a ceremony known as Wendigo Kanzim Owen, where people would wear masks and dance backwards around a drum. Although the Wendigo works well as a deterrent to man-eating, it is also used in a less literal way that is essential to keep in mind to understand the deeper meaning of the legend.
Number 3. The Man in My Scope. This next story comes to us from an interview that a YouTuber, Funkalopagus, did with a hunter who thinks he had an encounter with the creature or something else deeply strange late at night. He originally posted this story to Reddit with the name Perpetual Connection, so that's what we'll call him if it comes up. He says he was hunting boar. He was saving up for a while to get a special thermal vision scope. He took it to a range and waited from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. to find a good boar to bag, but surprisingly wasn't finding anything. And he noted that the area that he went up to was shockingly empty of wildlife, no deer, no rabbits, no coyotes, nothing, as opposed to it usually being pretty plentiful. So he was getting himself ready to leave, assuming it must have just been a bad day, when he heard a crunch come from the direction that he'd entered the park. So he raised his scope to see what it was and saw initially what he assumed was a bear, some big mass on his scope. He zoomed in a bit and jolted when he realized it wasn't a bear, but looked a bit more like a man. Now what was disturbing him was that he was about 30 miles away from any other public areas. And there were no other cars parked around, no wildlife to speak of. The only other living thing next to him was this person in his scope, who happened to be completely naked, twitching and grabbing at all the foliage. The OP then says that the mysterious figure looked up at him and in an extremely unsettling, high-pitched feminine voice began to call out for help. The hunter believed that he was being trapped and scrambled to escape. He said it didn't sound like this voice should be coming from this entity. And he said that the creature was staring at him with a wide smile and unfurled itself standing on its back legs, standing 6 feet tall or maybe more. He pointed his weapon at the unknown entity and warned for it to stand down and said that it arched on its fours again and hissed at him like a cat before disappearing into the brush, screeching in a wail. The hunter would return to his car and drive off in an absolute panic, I think like most of us would, and he would tell authorities what he saw, but he was only reprimanded for hunting at night. I mean, fair enough. If I reported that story to the sheriff or something, I think I as the sheriff would hear that and just, scratch that off and be like, oh, I'm not messing with that. So what do you think? Did he happen to come across someone in the woods who was just having a wild night on all of the substances, or was that a close encounter with death that he narrowly avoided? Number 2, the 2019 sighting. This next sighting happened in 2019. It's the same time as the first point. Coincidence? Absolutely, but worth mentioning nonetheless. This next story was posted to Reddit by a user named Bradley Innovates. Bradley tells about how he had just been discharged, honorably, don't worry, from the Marines and was returning home to his home state of Alabama. Sweet home Alabama, and was catching up visiting on old friends. His best friend Jacob in particular, the two of them had been friends their whole life and usually got up to, boyhood stuff, hanging out in the woods, that kind of thing. The two of them traveled out to a secluded campsite that they'd enjoyed when they were younger, bringing a long arm with them for target practice. The two were chatting and eventually got onto stories of cryptids in the woods, namely, you guessed it, the Wendigo. His friend told him one could summon this creature by speaking its name 3 times into the woods like Bloody Mary. I've said its name like 9 times in this video. I'm speaking into a camera, so I hope that's okay. I hope I'm not cursing you out there. Might be best just to sage your house a little bit after watching this video. Anyway, Bradley played along and spoke his name out 3 times, only to discover nothing happened. Until he heard a snap in the woods, and his reflexes instinctively darted backwards. A few coyotes ran by, and his friend decided that it was enough scares for the woods and started to pack up when a tree began to fall forward towards them. Now, if that wasn't already unnerving, the Redditor said the next thing he heard was the voice of his friend's younger sister calling out to them both, except they didn't bring her along and she wasn't anywhere nearby, and that's when both of them knew they were in far deeper trouble than they thought. They claimed that they saw an emaciated, fleshy monster, deathly thin, with next to no meat on its bones, skin as pale as ash, and a vibrant blue eyes. That actually sounds pretty familiar, to be honest. The men fired at it and ran screaming from the woods towards their car. They escaped, horrified by what they saw, but luckily alive. If this story is true, then that has to be a real-life encounter with the creature. Number 1, Jack Fiddler. There truly aren't many sightings or stories of Wendigos, and indigenous people don't particularly like to share these stories out of their tribes. Despite the popularity on apps like TikTok, it's a pretty niche bit of folklore. Of course, it could also be because there are people out there maintaining the local population. Jack Fiddler, or Zanhano Gahengogawa, was an Ojibwe shaman living in Sandy Lake in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was renowned among his people for being a hunter of the supernatural, defending his tribe from threats that no one else would be willing. There are many documented cases of indigenous people who, feeling themselves lose control to the appetite or the spirit within them, would request that someone close and trusted would be the one to finish them off. This could be a close friend of the family or a family member. It was an act of mutual trust. Zanhano Gahengogawa claims to have felled 14 Wendigos during his lifetime like this. Of course, not everyone would see it this way. By 1906, word would reach the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties, that to them there was this is a quote, "a band of pagans in the habit of killing one another whenever one gets delirious through fever or other causes." By 1907, the mounted police had arrested Zanhano Gahengogawa and his brother Pescoquan for the death of Pescoquan's daughter-in-law. Locals in the tribe decried the decision, saying they didn't understand, and that the man they were accusing of being a killer was a quiet, dignified man who lived with a clear conscience. After 15 weeks of imprisonment, Zanhano Gahengogawa would escape from the police escort holding him. When they found him, he was lying on a rock with a sash tied in a knot around his neck. It was his way out of escaping persecution.
Number 5, I have the Wendigo from Borderlands 3. Borderlands 3 is the 4th installment of the main series Borderlands games and was released in 2019. The release was a success and the game met a lot of people's lofty expectations. The game is a first-person shooter game where you play as a vault hunter. There's a plethora of different quests and missions in this game, and as I'm sure you're all expecting, one of them is centered around a Wendigo. The Wendigo boss is found during a mission called Horror in the Woods. Yeah. Horror in the Woods, guys. It's safe to say the makers of this game know that this creature is freaking scary. You find this Wendigo in a deep, creepy looking cave. The Wendigo in this game is fast and extremely talented at climbing because oftentimes it will scale the walls of the cave on all fours. It has classic antlers jutting from its head and will often charge at the player. What's different than other adaptations of the Wendigo though, is that this thing can literally spit fire. As if scaling walls and being super fast and strong wasn't enough, the game makers decided to give this Wendigo the ability to breathe fire at you. That, on top of the fact that it's extremely hard to kill, has a skull for a face, and what looks to be muscle tendons for its body is what puts it on this list. I have it down here at number 5 though, because the graphics of Borderlands 3 aren't particularly scary, but it definitely deserves a nod. At number 4, we have the Wendigo from the video game Outriders. This is a third-person video game released earlier this year on most platforms. The premise of this game is that climate change has gotten to a place of no return, and the people of Earth have decided that they need to find another planet or they're going to die. Wow, that just got real very quickly. The player in this game takes on the role of an Outrider, who is an elite soldier tasked with being sent to this new planet that the human race wants to settle on. When they're there, they find a plethora of enemies, and sure enough, one of them is a Wendigo. This game doesn't have multiple Wendigos, it only has one, and let me tell you, it looks messed the heck up. It's got like bone things jutting from its back in unnatural, unsettling directions, and it's this one disgusting slit on its face that is either its eye or its mouth. I'm not even sure, it could be both. For hands, well, it doesn't really have hands actually. Instead of those, it has one massive sword-like weapon thing jutting from its right side, and then 3 more tiny claws coming out of its left side. Basically, this adaptation of a Wendigo is a freaking nightmare, and it has evolved to an advanced killing predator machine. In the game, this thing is also a boss, and super hard for the player to kill. For starters, I obviously don't want to get eaten, but if I'm gonna get eaten, can we just make it from a normal mouth, please? Not some slit thing that might also double as an eyeball. It's gonna be a hard pass from this guy. Coming in at number 3, we've got a Nevadan Wendigo. Not Nebraska, Nevada. This is a different tale, although curiously enough, the protagonist of this story is the same age as the protagonist of our farmhand extravaganza. Funny how that works. While exploring some abandoned mine shafts, great idea I know, this lad felt as if he was being watched. Moving right along, he eventually encountered some old abandoned cabins. After looking through, he found a well, and this well stunk to high heaven, a strange, acrid, coppery smell, sort of a mix between fresh blood, rotten meat, and pennies. Not wanting to be around it anymore, he decided to head back towards the mine shafts. However, when he did, he saw something crouching inside of one. At first, he thought it was a mountain lion, as he'd seen them around these parts before, but then he realized how big the thing crouching in the shaft was. The openings were usually 8 to 10 feet tall, and this thing couldn't stand up straight inside of it. It moved towards the opening, revealing a bunch of matted brownish fur, and then it screamed. The kind of scream that haunts your dreams until the end of your life. Our explorer pal felt his blood go cold and immediately shot at this creature with his rifle. A few rounds to the torso did nothing to stop it, however, and it continued to scream. Time to run. He scrambled away, jumping over fallen trees and occasionally turning back to fire quick pot shots and check if it was close. Eventually he made it back to his truck and hightailed it out of there, averaging 60 miles per hour. He drove without stopping until he got home where his dad was waiting. His dad asked him how the trip went and where he ended up, noticing that his son was quite shaken. When our mineshaft exploring storyteller explained to his dad where he'd been, his dad appeared concerned and told him to never go back to that location. They didn't talk about it again. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Allegheny forest encounter. As I find more and more of these stories, I realize how absolutely terrifying the forest can be. Did I realize this as a kid when I went camping, or when I decided to go way off track while visiting remote cottages? Probably not, but I'm still here, right? This story comes from a hunter and his seasoned outdoorsman buddy. They'd gone fishing in the woods and made sure to prepare adequately. Black bears around that area, so they had their guns with them. After encountering a mangled deer corpse, they were a little unsettled. However, they chalked it up to a bear or maybe some coyotes and kept moving. A little while later, something set off the buddy's spidey senses and he asked for his gun. Moving to the middle of the creek, they saw a bear running through the woods full tilt. It was followed pretty closely by a deer headed in the same direction. But why would a deer be chasing a bear? Well, it wouldn't. Something was chasing both of these creatures, something huge. From afar it looked like a massive deer with superimposing antlers, but as it ran, it noticed the two hunters and moved towards them. When it got up close, they realized that it had a huge maw full of teeth that could only be described as belonging to a carnivore. That was all the warning they needed. Shooting at the beast while running away, they made sure to put as much distance between them and it as possible. Eventually they made it to a plateau where nothing seemed to be wrong. Reloading their weapons and looking around for any sign of trouble, they realized they were in the clear. Miles from their base camp, they hiked all the way back on high alert but never encountered the creature again. Even now, they have no idea what the hell they ran into. And at number 1, we've got another farm experience. This one doesn't stem from working on a farm though, it stems from living on one. When the writer was about 13, he and some friends lived in a rural area and would often get together to goof around in the woods. Meeting at one friend's farm, they chased each other around with sticks for a little while. However, our narrator ran off and stumbled upon a dead deer with some limbs missing. This led to the discovery of a bunch of dismembered animal parts strewn about the entrance to the woods. At that point, most of the friends went back to the farmhouse, while our fearless storyteller and a couple more pals went to investigate. This expedition resulted in the discovery of a dead cow with missing ribs, broken legs, and a head picked clean of soft tissue. Yuck. That was it for the night, and everyone got home safe. About a week later though, while hanging out near his house, the storyteller heard what he thought was his dog. Thinking it would rush out of the bush and beg for a treat, he wandered in the direction the noise was coming from, but what came out of the bush was not his dog. It was a shambling abomination, walking around like a newborn doe, covered in viscera with teeth as sharp as knives. Needless to say, he ran right inside. That night, while gripping a baseball bat in bed, he heard an awful scratching upon the wall outside his room. As this happened, his dog started freaking out, barking at the back door. Our storyteller rushed downstairs and grabbed the dog, double checking that his door was locked, and he stayed up all night listening for more. The noises eventually subsided and dawn broke. In the morning light, he peeked outside the door and saw an assortment of pig's feet strewn about the porch. Yikes. Coming in at number 5, we've got a Nevadan escapade. This story comes from a self-proclaimed survivalist living in Nevada. They open up the tale with a bit of a disclaimer, saying that they never really believed in the paranormal before this happened. In fact, prior to experiencing this, they would have assumed that anything strange going on would likely be the result of government experiments and the like. There was absolutely no way they expected an experience like the one I'm about to summarize. So the survivalist had a couple weeks of vacation saved up and didn't want to let it roll over to the next year. Taking that time off, he didn't really know what to do with himself. After a day of doing nothing, he decided to go camping on his own, as none of his friends were able to take any time off. Away he went, packing some basic supplies and grabbing coffee and donuts on the way out. After setting up camp in the middle of nowhere, the survivalist decided to have a little vodka and do some target shooting. Following an encounter with a jackrabbit, he came across a freshly killed coyote. Seeing as hunting coyotes is relatively common practice in Nevada, he didn't think much of it, but he still saw the way the body was left as strange. Weird smell too. That evening, while scanning through some capped channels on his ham radio, the survivalist came across something odd. Knowing that there was military presence in the area, he wasn't too surprised to hear the sounds of gunfire coming through the speaker. However, these wargame sounds were followed up by what he described as nails on a chalkboard and a blood-curdling scream. Immediately after hearing these noises, the radio crapped out. Uh-oh. Reassuring himself that whatever happened there was hundreds of miles away, he went to bed. The next day, while puttering about, he wandered into a fenced-off military area, letting him know that whatever those noises were last night, they were probably closer than he assumed. Exploring this area more, he came across a cave that piqued his interest. Heading inside, he didn't notice anything odd at first, but soon became attuned to a very particular rotting smell. The same smell he noticed when coming across the oddly killed coyote. This tipped something off in his head and he got the hell out of there. At that point, the survivalist was terrified. Returning to his camp, he found that it had been raided. Everything was torn up, tossed about, and emptied, and nothing was missing though. While checking on his equipment, he noticed that all of these sounds in the area had stopped, dead quiet as night fell. And that's when he saw it. A humanoid creature standing off to the side, looking straight at him with dark voids for eyes. Hell, it even looked like it cracked a little smile. The survivalist tried to shoot it, but his bullets didn't seem to do anything but piss it off, making it scream in an ungodly fashion. Seeing that his weapon wasn't doing much, he booked it out of there and found a crevice to hide out in until sunrise. And when the sun rose, he got the hell out of there, ASAP. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Forest Ranger. Being a forest ranger must be fascinating, right? Out in the wilderness all day, every day, minimal human contact, keeping an eye on the local flora and fauna, occasionally taking part in rescues, maybe helping a lost hiker find their way, wearing a cool hat. What a life. Of course, it isn't all fun and games. There are plenty of harrowing situations one can find themselves in when deep in the forest. However, mythical monsters don't usually come up during job training, so you better watch out. Take this tale from a forest ranger somewhere in the States. While responding to a missing persons report, they found themselves in a tricky area of the hiking trail. At some point it splits, with one of the paths leading people deeper into the forest instead of back to the service area. Naturally, the ranger called for some backup, and about a half hour later his backup showed up. Ranger and backup head off into the woods, calling out for the missing person, but to no avail. And when they got to the split in the path, Mr. Backup disappeared too. Trying for a while to contact the missing backup on their walkie, the ranger got a little spooked. Then, when all hope seemed to be lost, he ran into someone matching the description of the original missing person. However, this individual didn't respond to anything the ranger said to them. The ranger took the person back to their truck and told them to wait in the back while he went to look for his backup again. At this point, his backup chimed in on the walkie, saying that he had found the missing hiker at the bottom of a hill with a broken leg and would be returning with him soon, which didn't line up with what he had seen. The ranger went back to the truck and saw that it was empty, with the passenger door wide open and the cage inside bent out of shape. Apparently that kind of stuff had been happening for a while too. Folks hearing their neighbors calling out in the night when they knew their neighbors were on vacation, or perhaps hearing their dog barking outside when the dog was at the foot of their bed.
Coming in at number 3 on this list is the Wendigos from Fallout 76. Fallout 76 is another installment in the Fallout series, which for the most part has gotten excellent reviews. Although many thought that this video game as a whole did not meet the standards of the previous Fallout games, they definitely nailed it with their adaptation of the Wendigo. The Wendigo in Fallout 76 is a very fast and strong enemy that can be found in various locations around the map. Unlike the previous 2 video games mentioned, there are multiple Wendigos that the player has to deal with. Sticking to the folklore, the purpose of this enemy is to eat the player, and if you aren't careful or properly armed, they will succeed. What is different about Fallout 76 is that these creatures have different variations to them. The Ravenous Wendigo, the Glowing Wendigo, and the Scorched Wendigo can all be found throughout this game. The designation of what type of Wendigo they are is determined by environment or where the player is in the game. The image of the Wendigo changes slightly depending on what type of subspecies it falls under. However, they all have some general characteristics. They kind of look like a bigger and stronger Gollum from Lord of the Rings. The difference here is that rather than want to have the one ring of power, they just want to kill you and eat your flesh. Especially the ravenous ones. I mean, it's literally in their name. They are ravenous, so I can only assume that these Wendigos are pretty hungry. Coming in at number 2 is Seeking Evil the Wendigo. Seeking Evil the Wendigo is a PC game that came out in 2017 that is very similar to the likes of Slenderman. Deep in the dark forests of North America, your character wakes up in the night left stranded for dead. As if waking up disoriented in the woods wasn't enough, well, these aren't ordinary North American forests. This is the hunting ground of the Wendigo. The main mission in this game is to survive the likes of this demonic super predator. Problem is, this thing is quick. It's really quick. Quicker than your character. Like every video game, as you progress, it gets harder and harder, meaning the Wendigo gets tougher to avoid. This video game isn't like the other video games. You can't just brute force your way through it. To get rid of the curse of the Wendigo, you have to find and light totem poles that are scattered throughout the forest. Every time you light a totem pole though, this creature from hell gets faster, stronger, and more importantly, hungrier. It's said that this game requires a lot of thinking instead of the initial run from point A to point B strategy, which is a bit of a problem for me because if I'm getting chased by one of these legendary blood fiends, I'd probably be running for my life. Number 1 on this list is the Wendigos from Until Dawn. Until Dawn is a critically acclaimed PlayStation 4 video game released in 2015. What makes this game so unique is that the player can control 8 different characters. The game utilizes a butterfly effect technique where the player may make a decision as one of the characters that can then affect all of the other characters and alter the entire story. This video game often appears on other lists of the scariest video games of all time, and for good reason. The 8 players are trapped on Blackwood Mountain and they have to survive an onslaught of Wendigos. Rather than have one demonic Wendigo, this video game goes in the direction of having multiple enemies. These Wendigos also stray from the classic image of a moose humanoid-esque creature and are humans that have just mutated into cannibalistic demons due to being possessed by the Wendigo spirit. I'm not gonna lie, the graphics of these Wendigos are very unsettling. They took what Fallout 76 did and they just went way scarier with it. The Wendigos appear as these white skinny mutated beings with extremely sharp teeth and a deep desire to eat you. What brings this video game to another level to me is just how real the story gets. Without giving too much away, one of the main Wendigos was just another character that the player gets to know and that went missing a year earlier. The image of having a family member or a friend disappear and then show up a year later looking like one of those things and trying to eat me is not a happy thought. The backstory of how the Wendigos got to this mountain is also extremely creepy. It's said that in a nearby mine, the miners got trapped and had to resort to eating one another to survive. The first of these Wendigos would have been these trapped miners from years prior who ate their friends to survive. Yeah. It gets pretty dark, guys. Remind me to never go camping again, my friends.
Coming in at number 5, we've got Jack Fiddler, Wendigo Hunter. And we'll kick this one off with not 1, not 2, but 14 purported Wendigo sightings. Possibly more if Jack wasn't able to get them before his untimely death. Back in the day, there was a man who claimed to be able to kill Wendigos. This man was known as Zauno Hishigo Galbo, but European settlers just knew him as Jack Fiddler. He lived in what's now known as the Sandy Lake First Nation and was a well-respected healer. He would go from community to community, ensuring the health of many people, but often he was sought out for more macabre business, fighting cannibalistic creatures. Jack would euthanize anyone who felt that the curse of the Wendigo was upon them. They sought him out to end their lives before they caused any trouble for their loved ones in their communities. Potions and ceremonies would mitigate damage, but death was the only surefire way to end a Wendigo's curse. And even then, it's a little tricky to deal with. So Jack would go from place to place, ensuring that Wendigos truly found their final resting place. After euthanizing the cursed individual, he would also perform a ritual cremation and burial to seal it away for good. Tales of his exploits eventually reached the Mounties though, who did not seem to think what Jack was doing was community service. After some investigation, they found out about a woman who was thought to be possessed. She was choked to death by her father-in-law and his brother. Any guesses as to who the brother was? Jack Fiddler. So the Fuzz arrested the men, claiming that what the law forbids, no pagan belief can justify. Jack eventually managed to slip away from the police before his trial and killed himself to avoid the long arm of the law. 14 counts of murder is a tough sentence, especially when assisted suicide and demon hunting were not considered valid defenses. Coming in at number 4, we got the Wendigos of Blackwood Mountain. Boom. Butterfly effect. This pod of people eaters comes from the choose your own horrific adventure game Until Dawn, featuring a pre-Bohemian Rhapsody Rami Malek. In this game, you make decisions that will end up sealing the fate of 8 unlucky vacationers. See, this group of pals decided to return to Blackwood Mountain a year after a tragic disappearance. They brought some friends up and pulled a nasty prank, resulting in one running off into the night. What the friends might not have known is that the area had been frequented by Wendigos for centuries. European miners came to the area back in the 1800s and were warned off by natives who claimed the mountain was sacred. As settlers tend to do, they ignored this advice and started excavating anyways. In doing so, they released the Wendigo spirits. Later on, in the mid-1900s, a group of miners came back for some of those sweet, sweet minerals. They fell victim to some unfortunate accidents though and found themselves trapped in the mine shafts. Forced to cannibalize to survive, the remaining miners became Wendigos. After a powerful Wendigo was killed, its spirit was transferred to the unfortunate friend who ran off into the night. And you guessed it, this unfortunate individual came back with a vengeance. One by one, depending on how you play it, people fall victim to the Wendigo of Blackwood Mountain, sometimes becoming terrible creatures themselves. So next time you're in a survival situation, ask yourself if it's worth eating people and becoming a depraved monster in order to live. I'd take the long nap, to be honest. Coming in at number 3, we've got a deep woods discovery. There's nothing quite like having your expectations subverted, yeah? I don't want to spoil too much of this story before I tell it, so here we go. I found this one in green text format, and it seems to be coming from a person living in a rural area. Every year, they find that hiking in the wooded area near their home is quite pleasant in the fall, so they head out to do just that. However, they seem to find some of the more overgrown areas unsettling. Makes sense, especially if you're far away from society at large. As they explore a little more, they notice something dive into the bushes, giving them a start. At that point, the hiker has had enough and decides to book it. There's something nearby though, and it seems to be following quite closely. Eventually, the hiker makes it to the end of the trail and realizes that they have to go back where they came from. After the experience they had, they're not looking forward to it. In the end, they do indeed buck up and head back to the top of the trail. When they get to the part where they saw something dive into the bushes, they realize that it wasn't a monster or anything sinister, but in fact a little girl. She calls out for help, but as the hiker gets closer, a strange feeling washes over him. It looks like the girl is hurt and can't walk on her own, but when the hiker gets close enough for the little girl to see him, she begins screaming bloody murder. Oh no. It's at this point that the hiker gives up all pretenses and eats the girl, taking her form. Bet you didn't see that one coming. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Mooseman. Let's take a quick trip to Alberta, except instead of seeing the mountains or hockey, we'll go looking for shape-shifting terrors. Hooray! There were tales circulating around for a while about some sort of centaur with moose features instead of horse ones, although many claim these to be patently false. That's not going to stop me from talking about it as if it were real though. This thing lived by the river and never got too close to human settlements. However, it would often kill and mutilate game animals to make them unusable. In fact, it's also said to have been involved in the killing and maiming of many men as well. Beyond the moose-centaur comparison, there isn't much to be said about the way this creature looks. It's huge, as all moose tend to be, and walks around with flesh hanging from its antlers. Like many creatures in the same vein, it reeks of something otherworldly and tends to make hideous noises when encountered. Whether the moose look is its only avatar or one of many forms, we may never know. And finally, at number 1, we've got the Roadrunner. Meep meep indeed. While walking his dog at around 10 p.m., our storyteller came across a couple dead rabbits accompanied by a horrid stench. Assuming it was just a fox or something, he moved right along. Soon after, his dog started acting super weird though. It wouldn't move at all and seemed to be staring at something off in the distance, eyes wide. Then the smell came back. This time he couldn't quite place where it was coming from, but he'd heard enough stories about bad smells and evil vibes in the woods to know to be careful. He took his dog and got off the path, hiding in some tall grass to the side. That's when he saw it. Something almost indescribable. Gray skin, rotten flesh, a horrible, emaciated horse's head, limbs that only seemed to half work. Made him want to run away at full speed immediately, but that was a bad call with it so close by. Sneaking seemed to be the better choice. The man and his dog started creeping away and got about 50 feet. The creature was out of sight now and the man thought he could start running. But apparently the Roadrunner knew exactly where he was trying to sneak away to and was immediately on his tail. Thankfully, the sneaking gave this man and his dog a bit of a head start and they were off to the races. As they ran from this awful beast, the man could hear it breathing. It sounded like an overexcited child, happy to be running in the woods in search of something good. Thankfully, getting back to the jagged gravel path proved to be a challenge for the Roadrunner. Whatever was wrong with its limbs made it difficult to traverse the rocky terrain, and eventually it gave up, screaming all the while. The man hasn't seen the creature again, but that's no guarantee that it's not around. shapeshifting isn't uncommon with these kinds of things. Well, how do you feel about the Wendigo now? Any better or worse than when we started?
Number 5, some strange noises. One of the creature's signature calling cards is said to be its horrific wails, its pained shrieks that don't sound like any animal you'd recognize. It's also said that it's been able to imitate human voices to better lure out its prey. And perhaps those disconcerting sounds were caught on tape as recently as 2019, when a series of howls and shrieks left a hunter and a government biologist searching for answers as to what was going on in those woods. Gino Mikas was hunting with his wife and grandson in northwest Ontario in a fairly remote rural area, about 50 kilometers away from the nearest sign of civilization, most likely an en route. Sorry, rest of the world, that joke is just for Ontario. It's a Canadian cryptid, what can I say? At first, I thought it was a moose, but my mind changed when it screamed again and again. Mikas is an avid hunter, a resident of Sioux Lookout, and knows his way around the woods and what creatures should be living in it. He added on saying, "I've heard many different animals in the wild, but nothing like this. I grew up hunting with my grandfather for the first 12 years of my life. The howls initially came from the distance, but soon appeared closer." We've got the clip, so why don't you take a listen for yourself and see what you think. Now, some speculated that it could be a grizzly bear. However, there's not a lot of evidence for that since grizzlies don't really live in these surrounding areas. They are known to roam, but there's not reports of grizzly bears nearby. Others speculated that it could be a wolf, which definitely is possible, but you would think that an expert seasoned hunter would recognize a wolf. So, there's a number of people who speculate that this could be the mythical Wendigo caught on tape. And if you're looking for way more stories of folklore, creatures, cryptids, well, you already know what channel I'm gonna recommend. It's the one you're watching right now. We've got tons and tons of scary lists just waiting for you to discover. So hit that subscribe button, please make sure to hit that bell so you don't miss a single scream and get all caught up. But do that at the end of this video if you wouldn't mind. I got way more Wendigo sightings coming up for you. Number 4, Southern Ontario sighting. Our next story also comes to us from my home province of Ontario. Makes a lot of sense. It's where a number of regional myths revolving around the Wendigo all originally stem from. Now this one comes to us from an anonymous Redditor who posted to the Skinwalkers subreddit detailing a strange encounter that they had, possibly with the creature. You take a listen to this. "I decided to take my dog out for a walk this afternoon and not put my headphones in. As we were walking along, I heard a voice calling out my name in a sing-songy way. I stopped and looked around and I called for my dog to come back to me, and he stopped where he was and stared at me for a while and then eventually came to me. I didn't acknowledge it. I walked around a little more and still didn't see anything. Now, I live with my parents, and my mom knows that stories about skinwalkers freak me out. A few days ago, we were having a bonfire, and she hid and tried to call for me in a scary voice to freak me out, so I assumed this was the same thing happening. I continued walking and I heard, 'Come over here,' and I was so freaked out because this sounded like it was my voice saying it, and I heard this so much more clearly, like it was coming from inside my head. I have no idea what was out there this afternoon, but I can tell you for certain I will never walk out there without my headphones on again. Can honestly say this was the weirdest experience of my life." Now, if you believe the legends and folklore, if you hear the creature calling out for you, the only correct thing to do is to ignore its attempts to lure you away. You don't want to go toe to toe with this thing. You're not going to stand a chance. So it sounds like the original poster in this situation, even though they were scared out of their wits, still made the right decision and got off with just a scare and a story instead of something much, much worse.
Number 3, Wendigo as a metaphor. Beyond viewing the Wendigo as a literal monster or as a boogeyman created to prevent people from eating each other in desperate times, some people view the Wendigo as a metaphor for greed and its all-consuming nature, helping to reinforce the communal values that let members of a tribe live well together in their environments. Interestingly, native scholars have used this metaphor in modern contexts to great effect. For example, in his 1978 book Columbus and Other Cannibals, The Wetico Disease of Exploitation, Imperialism and Terrorism, Dr. Jack D. Forbes uses the Wendigo as a metaphor for the attitudes and behaviors of domination and exploitation enacted on his people. As he writes, "I have come to the conclusion that imperialism and exploitation are forms of cannibalism, and in fact, are precisely those forms of it which are most diabolical or evil, going on to say that the treatment of minorities clearly attests to the fact that, quote, the wealthy and exploitative literally consume the lives of those they exploit. This really shows how effective this legend is as a metaphor for greed, working just as well in a tribal setting to prevent people from hoarding what little food was available, as it does in a modern setting where imperialism's need to make others suffer for the benefit of a ruling class is explored. So, from a metaphorical standpoint, the Wendigo is undeniably real. We just call it capitalism. Number 2. Wendigo psychosis. Whether the Wendigo is real or not, there are documented examples of people going mad and engaging in Wendigo-like behavior. People who crave a more scientific explanation coined the term Wendigo psychosis to explain this behavior. The term is controversial, but has been applied to instances in the past as a means of explanation. For example, in the 1661 Jesuit Relations, which were published progress reports by Jesuit missionaries, reported about an incident that was believed to be the result of Wendigo possession, but has later been labeled as Wendigo psychosis. Here is the translated quote. What caused us greater concern was the news that met us upon entering the lake, namely, that the men deputed by our conductor for the purpose of summoning the nations to the North Sea and assigning them a rendezvous, were there to await our coming, had met their death the previous winter in a very strange manner. Those poor men, according to the report given to us, were seized with an ailment unknown to us, but not very unusual among the people we were seeking. They were afflicted with neither lunacy, hypochondria, nor frenzy, but have a combination of all these species of disease, which causes them a more than canine hunger. This makes them so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men like veritable werewolves, and devour them voraciously, without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more they consumed, the more greedily they ate. This ailment attacked our deputies, and as death is the sole remedy among these simple people for checking such acts of murder, they were slain in order to stay the course of their madness. Another strange case was a Plains Cree trapper named Swift Runner in Alberta, who was starving with his family in 1879 when his oldest son died. He consumed him, but went on to end the lives of and eat his 6 remaining family members. This was attributed to Wendigo psychosis due to the fact that he was only 25 miles away from a Hudson's Bay Company post, which had emergency food supplies, showing that his actions were not a last-ditch effort to avoid starvation, but a horrific and crazed act. This real behavior reinforced the belief in the Wendigo. But I promised I would tie this all back to the government, and I will. The Canadian government. Number 1. Real Wendigo hunters. This entry focuses more on the belief that the Wendigo is a spirit who possesses people rather than causes them to turn into a giant monster. This belief has caused a few situations where people attributed violent acts to possession by the Wendigo spirit, or in other cases took the lives of people thinking that they were possessed and that their death was the only way to prevent the dangers of the Wendigo from taking innocent lives. An infamous case was the story of Jack Fiddler, the chief and shaman of the Sucker Dudum among the Anishinaabe in the northwest Ontario. He was renowned among his people for his ability to defeat Wendigos, having claimed to have defeated 14 of them during his life. He said that some of them had been sent by enemy shamans and some were afflicted members of his own band. In these cases, many of the afflicted's family members, or oftentimes the afflicted themselves, would request that Fiddler euthanize them according to their people's rites before they turned Wendigo. Fiddler resisted efforts to have his people convert to Christianity, making them some of the only indigenous people left in North America who were living traditionally with very little government interference in their legal or religious matters. In 1907, 2 members of the Northwest Mounted Police heard about Jack Fiddler and his Wendigo fighting and decided that this was a perfect opportunity to introduce Canadian law to the North. They arrested Jack and his brother Joe for murder, keeping them in captivity while awaiting trial. Canadian newspapers picked up and sensationalized the story, saying that it involved devil worship, and people across the country demanded a conviction, while the police investigating the issue viewed it as an opportunity for fame and advancement. Jack Fiddler escaped and took his own life, and his brother was charged despite testimony showing that the deaths had been euthanization of very ill people in an effort to protect their tribe, and that they were ignorant of Canadian law. He was sentenced to death, although further appeals secured his release. Unfortunately, the release order came 3 days after he had died. Without their leaders, Jack's people were forced to accept government rule and signed Treaty No. 5. Oddly enough, the government has not been very open about the fact that they sentenced 2 men to death in an effort to assert their power and dominance, and to bring fame and notoriety to their agents. See, I told you I'd bring it back to the government.
Coming in at our first sighting today is a short clip that's been being passed around the paranormal corners of the internet, and for good reason. Could very well have a recording of one of these wretched creatures caught on tape. Let me roll just a little bit of it for you and see if you can decide for yourself just what's going on down there. It's hard to say exactly what's happening here without proper context. Unfortunately, the original person who posted it didn't add a lot. We can see a bunch of animals running through the forest, migrating, or perhaps they're running to try and escape something, namely the very strange entity running behind them. We can see someone or something running swiftly, looking human-esque, but it feels more like something's doing an impression of a human, something that's wearing a human skin, if you catch my drift. Doesn't quite move how a man should. Its arms appear unnaturally long and out of proportion. It seems like a feral creature living amongst the animals in disguise. Now, not everyone agrees with what this creature could be. Some commenters have suggested that this could be a sighting of a rake, which is also sometimes called a crawler, a similarly reported cryptid. It's a long, skinny, humanoid looking thing, usually with like pale or gray skin, that lives out in the wood. Now, there are a bunch of differences between these creatures. For one thing, a rake is not a shapeshifter of any kind, whereas one of these is said to be able to take the appearance of any creature it wishes. It should also be noted that when we talk about skinwalkers, traditionally they're not actually cryptids or monsters, but rather a human who's capable of witchcraft. It's hard to keep all your scary humanoid cryptids straight in a line, but that's why you got Top 5 Scary to help out where you can. And if you're looking for way more scary stories of cryptids, well, my friend, you are already in the right place. If cryptids aren't your jam, we've got a video on just about every single freaky thing you can think of under the sun and above it. We got conspiracies, we got aliens, we got monsters, monster movies, you name it. Hit subscribe, hit that little bell so you don't miss a single scream, but you do that at the end of this video, okay? I got way more creature sightings coming for you right now. Number 4, another video sighting for you coming up. Well, of sorts, you'll see. This next one was uploaded to the internet about a month ago to Reddit, titled Navajo Depiction of a Skinwalker on Video Looking to Plant a Curse. Hey, you might want to check that your computer's got good antivirus software just in case some of that curse sort of leaks through the internet. That does happen sometimes. So keep that in mind as we roll this next clip. Maybe draw a little salt circle around where you're sitting just in case. Smudge your house with sage, I would advise. Now, this footage comes from a documentary, so it's not exactly the most real depiction of one of these creatures, but it's fun to watch. It's a documentary on the beast of native folklore and showcases a depiction or a dramatization of what a live sighting face to face with one could look like. It's pretty horrifying to see such a realistic depiction. I think you imagine these creatures and it's pretty scary, but then you see it like in a tableau like this and you realize just how scary it is. We see a bunch of livestock running in a flock and a shadow darting between them as if your eyes are playing tricks on you. Is this just another shadow of the night? Is this an animal? Just your eyes? We then see the homeowner readying himself to defend against the particular attack. Now, something unnerving about the legend of these creatures is just how little there is said to be done against them. Some stories say that the way to fell one of these entities is by learning its name and shouting it against it. Now, some others say that traditional weapons have next to no use against one. Maybe you'll slow it down just a little bit, but that you need rituals and otherworldly magic to be able to actually stand a chance. And of course, there are some nihilistic stories that say once the creature has set its sights on you, well, it's kind of hopeless and there's not really anything you can do until your judgment comes. So the best advice for me, I would say, is to just never run into one at all, and if you even start to think you hear one, just book it out of Dodge. Number 3, Motoins. Motoins is a popular YouTuber and influencer known for BMX and motorcycling videos. Owen's a motorcycle enthusiast, and so his channel primarily focuses on motorcycle content, reviews of new bikes, advice for riders, general discussion about the wild world of motorcycling. But that's not all. He's also got videos about his personal experiences and his travels on 2 wheels, including almost coming dangerously close to death while in the woods while filming a video. You take a quick look at this clip posted to his Instagram and you tell me what you think you hear or see. Probably something scary. While cycling, Owen comes across some bizarre sounds in the woods that he believes sounds like someone screaming out for help. It's hard to say that's not exactly what it sounds like, because it does sound like someone shrieking, but that could be something mimicking human calls. Now, more than a few people in the comments suggested this could be a mountain lion, because allegedly mountain lion calls sound like a shrieking woman. That's something hikers should be aware of. I've never heard that before. Now, I've got to say, Owen is a pretty wise guy, because as soon as he starts hearing mysterious screaming in the wild that he can't explain, instead of poking around the woods and trying to figure out what's happening, he rather intelligently chooses to get on his bike, rev up, and gets the heck out of there before he could get a chance to be introduced to whatever cryptid could have been lying out there. So what do you think, gang? Was that just a bobcat or a mountain lion out in the woods, or did he come very, very close to something he would not have wanted to see? Number 2. Wow, man, my titles for this one are really good, eh? Sighting. Skinwalker sighting. Our next story was also posted to the Skinwalker subreddit by user MothGirl11. It's the freshest one up on the list too, posted just 11 days ago, so I hope they're doing well. It starts by saying, I have recently learned what skinwalkers are, and it completely made sense of an event that had happened to me when I was younger that I previously blocked out of my brain. I was visiting my mom's family in California with my parents and siblings. I'd been there before, and I always slept alone on an air mattress in the living room, which had a greenhouse glass pane wall to the front of the house. It was a usual summer evening and everyone was settled into bed. I remembered that I used to like staying up late playing games on my DS. Yeah, I've been getting a little sleepy when I started to hear strange rustling noises coming from the outside. I sat up and peered outside, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The road outside was dimly lit. A few minutes pass and I tell myself it's just a strange animal or something. I laid myself back down, something across the street caught my eye, and I darted back up. Silently, I saw what appeared to be two coyote-like figures, only they were walking on their hind legs, which looked much bigger than their front ones. They appeared to be 6, maybe 7 feet tall, and the scariest part was there was absolutely no noise while they moved. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. One of them turned to look towards me, and I ducked my head down. At the time, I didn't think anything other than that I was freaked out. I never asked anyone about it, and it was only as an adult that I realized that there are no animals like the ones I saw. You've got to be a really, really brave kid, I think, to see 2 7-foot-tall bipedal coyotes and think, yeah, that's just something coyotes do. I would spend the rest of my life buying silver bullets and drawing like salt circles on the floor. Oof. Alright, and at number 1, the new property. Our final story comes to us from someone who might have cursed themselves into moving into a haunted property. Let's take a listen to this posted on a paranormal subreddit by user 1additional2103. It starts by saying, we've been living at this new house for 13 days. We've been taking some suggestions for cleansing the home to get any bad vibes out, but there's a creepy pattern happening. For the 3rd time, I just found bones just outside our door. Hey, whoa. Stop the track. Stop the music. Stop the narration. Stop everything. This was the 3rd time you found bones outside your front door, and you didn't burn your house down and move 6 states over. Anyway, okay, yeah, moving on. A few nights ago, there was a pile of smaller bones by the door leading to the front porch. This is a really clear message. On one of the first few nights, there was a long bone by the rear door right where I found a deer skull. I didn't think anything of it the first few times. Again, aside, I'm not sure why, but whatever, I gotta move on from this. Assuming the long bone was left there by a previous owner, and I chalked up the pile to an animal, but it's kind of weird that it's happened 3 times now, and each time by a door. The other strange things happening to me are I can't get the motion lights to work outside at all. They were already installed. I changed bulbs twice now in them and they worked when I went inside, but the next night they didn't. So I'm just chalking this one up to bad wiring. A few times I've heard very strange sounds coming from the woods. I'm an avid hunter and I do a lot of camping, and I've never heard anything like this before. It kind of sounds like a propeller chopping through wood. Do either of these things sound like I'm dealing with something out of my league? I'm sorry if these are dumb questions and stories, but there's just something about this property that makes me worried. Dude, you mentioned that bones keep showing up on your front door. You live in the same forest as the Blair Witch, man. You gotta move. Yeah, you're dealing with something above your head. Oh, you don't even need to go to the internet or Reddit for this one. That's about all she wrote, my ghouls and goblins. This goes without saying, but really, honestly, truly, if you are ever living on a property where bones keep mysteriously appearing on your front door, please just move. Alright, number 5. Now before we dive in proper, I did want to take a quick aside to point out that traditionally a lot of Dene people don't particularly like sharing stories of skinwalkers, as it is a fairly taboo subject. With that in mind, I thank the storytellers who did share the ones I was able to find, and want to stress though with this video, we are just hoping to entertain. Now with that in mind, let's get into it. Our first story was posted to us on a Skinwalker subreddit. I clipped it a little bit, but the rest of it's intact. Let me start off by saying that my wife doesn't believe in paranormal things. We've got cats, and one of them likes to be a rebel, jumping onto counters and meowing as loud as he can for attention. He does this all night. The other night, after some drinks and video games, I decided to head to bed. When I woke up, my wife had wide eyes and a nervous look. I asked her what happened, and she said that at around 3 a.m. in the morning, she was woken up by a noise that sounded like one of the cats howling, except that the meow sounded more like a person trying to imitate a cat, sounding like it was saying hello. Meow. Yeah, that's what it would sound like. A loud bang came at the door, and then a notification went off on the motion sensor. And when she told me this, I checked my phone, and sure enough, there was a notification for motion at around 2:52 a.m. I asked her why she didn't wake me, and she said she didn't want it to hear her. Everything was making me uncomfortable about this story, so I set the home security alarm around 9 p.m. and I didn't turn it off until I walked the dog this morning. We slept with all the animals in the bedroom with the door closed, so whatever tripped it was not one of our pets, and it made me think it was a skinwalker, but I'm just paranoid. I checked all the rooms when I got up. I don't know why, but my wife was scared so badly. We bought this house brand new and no one lived here before me, but when I'm alone, I feel like something's off and I'm being watched. I got home from errands today, and when I went to hang up a shirt, I noticed a board that covers our attic had been moved. I asked my wife what happened, and she said she has no idea. We're going to my mother-in-law's today to get some sage. My wife said burning it should keep whatever is around us away. Well, what do you think, my gang? Just paranoid? Or is there perhaps something suspicious sneaking around those woods? And my friends, if you're looking for more great creepy stories narrated by this blonde mug, you already know where to go. Top 5 Scary is the place to be. We've got a little something freaky for everyone. Cryptids, aliens, conspiracies, true crime, horror movies. If it's scary, we got a video or two on it. So hit subscribe, click that little bell, and don't miss a single thing. But do it at the end of this video, okay? I got more Skinwalker stories coming for you right now. Number 4. Our next story also comes to us from the Skinwalker subreddit. I mean, where else would Skinwalker stories come from, really? When my mother was young, she lived with my grandmother in a place full of wood. There were more woods than houses. You wouldn't really call it a street or a neighborhood. It was more a reserved area where the houses were all well away from each other. And there were so many trees and tall bushes that at night everything was dark. My mom had a dog named Toby. One night my mother and my grandmother were at home as usual, and they heard noise in the logs stacked outside. The lumber was for renovating the house, and it was right next to Toby's doghouse. My grandma went to see what he was doing, and when she went to scold him for messing with the lumber, she saw Toby's head come up and look at her. But he lifted his head so high that my grandmother saw what really was looking at her. She described what she saw as a person walking on all fours with their feet and hands touching the ground, but covered in black fur and a dog's head. Before returning home running, she noticed the real Toby was scared to death in his doghouse. Days later, Toby started to get sick. He wasn't eating properly and wouldn't leave the house. He was so scared that he'd go to the bathroom inside. He started to go blind, his fur started to fall out, and it wasn't long before he passed away out of fear. The same thing happened to a neighbor's dog, and maybe most concerningly, the chickens from another neighbor were plucked from the coop and split open. My mom and I talked about that time, and she told me that the thing tried to copy Toby's appearance, and the blindness was how they stun who they're going to eat. Number 3, it tried to lure me. Now our next one is a personal recounting from someone who thinks that they might have encountered a creature up close when they were younger. Same deal as before, paraphrased ever so slightly just for timing and content guideline purposes, but otherwise intact and presented to you how it was presented. Every summer, my family and I go up to camp in Ellsworth, Maine, and it's about a 3-hour drive from my house. The camp itself is about an hour from the nearest town. I've been going here my entire life, and I've never had something strange like this happen before. I was watching TV in the middle of the night when I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, and I realized that the dogs were going to need to go outside to do their doggy business. So I took them outside. I walked to the front yard and I took the dogs off the leash. It's incredibly dark in the woods in Maine, so I tried to keep my eyes on them. I was momentarily distracted seeing a loon on the lake. When I looked back, I saw that the dogs were looking at something in the woods. I couldn't see what it was, but I just assumed that they'd seen a squirrel or a raccoon. It was then that I realized I didn't see my third dog. She's a small dog and she's completely black. I heard some whimpering, so I stepped out and called out to her again, worried that she got stuck somewhere. Suddenly, I felt something close to me. I looked down and my Alfie was there, I just hadn't seen her. So I started thinking, if Alfie was with me, what was it that I'd heard? The other two dogs began to growl. They were walking towards the blackness of the woods. I picked up Alfie and began to back up when I heard the most absolutely bone-chilling thing I have ever heard in my life. I heard something calling Alfie's name. It sounded like it was trying to mimic me, but it was just wrong. The voice sounded distorted. I ran inside with the dogs, and I have no idea what was in the woods. It's been said that a skinwalker's mimicry doesn't just extend to their ability to change shape, but also to mimic speech. Could this have been a close encounter? How else would someone in the woods know the name of the storyteller's dog? Something to think about, and something to keep you awake all night. Number 2, the Corvid. Coming up next on our list of strange sightings of shape-shifting shamans is this video uploaded to TikTok of a raven that's got people saying, "No more!" Like nevermore? Quoth the raven, Edgar Allan Poe? I don't know. Sometimes I'm struggling for jokes. It was uploaded to TikTok by user Lindsay Ivan, and I don't know, something about her, she seems familiar, like I've heard her name before. Anyway, in the video we get an up-close and beautiful personal view of a beautiful raven with a very unnerving voice. It sounds as if it's got the voice of a human. Now, skinwalkers are said to be shape-shifting witches who can take the form of any animal they please and can mimic many voices. So is that what's happening here? Is that what this footage is? You sure that's why? Well, this next video I wanted to include solely because I wanted to debunk it, 1, and 2, take it as a small window of education for something I am very passionate about. Ravens are corvids, birds that are known for having hooked beaks and bristly feathers. They're usually black, although the blue jay is a very famous notable exception. Crows, ravens, magpies, jackdaws, jays, these are all corvids. Now, what makes corvids so interesting, and one of my favorite kind of birds out there ever, is they are unbelievably intelligent, with many ornithologists suggesting that ravens and crows, not only the smartest birds on the planet, but very well maybe like top 5 smartest animals out there. Among crows and ravens' many parlor tricks is that they're able to remember human faces. They understand the concept of causality. A raven understands what cause and effect is. Ravens can count, they've been shown making tools, they give gifts, they solve puzzles, and they can mimic sounds they hear with alarming clarity like a parrot. Everyone thinks of a parrot as a bird that can talk, but a crow and a raven can do it as well. So this beautiful bird in this clip is showing off his vocal range by mimicking human speech that he'd heard in a wondrous display of intellect from one of nature's most staggeringly impressive creatures. Or, of course, it could be a shape-shifting warlock of Danae legend that is grossly misattributed to almost every single random encounter on TikTok because the name sounds cool and people don't research things. Could be either one. Number 1, a scream in the woods. Coming up in the final spot today in our list of possible shapeshifters we just can't explain on camera is this viral video that's been making the rounds for its unexplained and terrifying nature. Now, this clip was originally uploaded under the name Strange Sounds While Mushroom Hunting. That sounds lovely. By user Tomorrow's Garden. Clicking through on the channel, we can see that they mostly stick to naturalist content, and when they're not doing that, they're reviewing the exciting world of stud finders and mouse traps. So supernatural hoaxes doesn't really seem to be a big part of their channel's identity, which is what makes this clip that much more real. In the clip, we see someone walking around a beautiful little forest as the user is checking out what's new with the local mycelium. Interrupting the bird song and the other beautiful sounds of the forest is a shrill scream that seems like it's come directly from hell, piercing not just your ears but your soul. Downright agonizing. Let's roll a clip of just that shrill shrieking. Pretty scary, right? Sounds like something that has crawled its way out of the depths of the pits of Tartarus and is deeply upset about it. Now, what unnerves me is how much you can maybe this doesn't make sense, hear a human scream inside the animal scream, if you follow me. The best part of this video though is that after the scream peters out, realizing that he's probably now hanging around somewhere where some sort of horrific flesh beast is lingering, he announces to himself very quietly, "I think it's time to go now." He says it so quietly and normally, it's hilarious. Unlike every horror movie guy ever, he just calmly decides to get out, and that's why he survived to upload this video. And Tomorrow's Garden, we thank you for.
Number 5 on this list is the orange eyes. As a decently recent university graduate, this story is pretty triggering to me. User John shared his story of how a relaxing midnight stroll turned terrifying when he came face to face with 2 skinwalkers. According to his chilling story, John was out late one summer night. While listening to music and enjoying the cool weather, he walked near a large empty field that was adjacent to a college campus. Suddenly, he felt something staring at him. Shining his flashlight out into the darkness, he saw 2 sets of glowing orange eyes staring back at him. The eyes were at least 7 feet off the ground and stared at him without blinking once. John made a mad dash for safety. As he was running, he turned back to see one of the creatures chasing him. John became even more frightened when he got a better glimpse of the fast-moving creature behind him. It looked like a giant wolf. Quickening his pace, John reached his home safely, but he remains fearful of the monsters he saw that night, which he believes were skinwalkers. I titled this entry Orange Eyes because that, plus the fact that they were 7 feet off the ground, are the biggest things that stick out to me here. A wolf's eyes aren't typically bright orange. They can be a mild hue of that color, but I doubt that it was a mild hue if that's the first thing that stuck out to him in the night. Not to mention the fact that these creatures were 7 feet off the ground and how unnatural that is. Even if for some reason a wolf stood on its hind legs, it still wouldn't be that tall. Whatever it was that was after John that evening doesn't sound like the friendliest of creatures if you ask me. He's probably pretty lucky to have made it out alive. Number 4 on this list is the white face. This story is especially scary because it seems like the skinwalker is actually stalking our victim. Ranker says, "My roommate has told me this story a few times and I want to see if anyone else has had similar experiences. As he tells it, he was driving home super late at night, maybe around 3 or 4 a.m. in a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, both times that this occurred. The first time he was driving alone on a road that has an open field to the left of it when out of nowhere a black figure on all fours bounds up out of the field and across the road in front of his car. As soon as the figure got to the other side of the road, it stops with inhuman quickness, turns around, and looks directly at my roommate. He described the figure as looking simian, completely black except for the face. The creature's face was a stark white human face. Not white as in Caucasian, but white as snow. This happened again a few weeks later, but this time the creature was sitting in a tree. As his car approached, it climbed down the tree, again with inhuman quickness, bounded across the road, stopped on a dime, and turned around and made eye contact with him. This time he had a friend in the car who also saw it and began freaking out. It was the same exact thing as the first time, a simian black body with a snow white expressionless human face. My roommate, ever the curious one, turned the car around and began searching for the creature, but it was nowhere to be seen. What has a totally black and creature-like body but also a white as snow pale human face? I'll answer that one for you guys. A skinwalker. Scariest part about this one, like I said earlier, is the fact that it went out of its way to find this same guy again. I find it hard to believe that he just happened to stumble upon this creature just out of coincidence. I think it's far more likely that the creature was looking out for this guy and putting itself into spots that it might run into him. Really not a pleasant thought if you think about it. Number 3 on this list is the toy rocking horse. This story doesn't even make any sense at all. It's just next levels of crazy. CVLT Nation says, "My uncle is Mexican and Native American. This happened in the Mojave Desert in Southern California. He was driving around with his girlfriend late at night and they saw something that looked like a huge black dog on the side of the road. He slowed down and the dog began crossing the road. Instead of walking like a normal dog would, this thing moved like a toy rocking horse. He said it stopped in the middle of the road and stared right at them and its eyes had a red glow. My uncle is the most badass person I know and it scared the crap out of him." So I'm honestly trying to figure out how the heck it moved like a toy rocking horse. That kind of doesn't make sense, you know? How would it get anywhere if it just kept rocking back and forth? I don't really understand, if I'm being honest, but apparently that's what went down. Which would definitely be enough to scare the bejesus out of me and never go back to the Mojave Desert again.
Number 2, the proof is out there. Our next sighting comes to us today from the History Channel of all places. I guess in a way it could be considered modern day history, right? It details a sighting by 2 Canadian security guards in 20 2021 of a possible sighting with this creature up close and personal. You see, it was May 2021 in Saskatchewan, and two security guards working on a Cree reservation were driving home after a 12-hour shift when they spotted something bizarre on the drive home. They recorded it, and we've got a bit of footage for you here to play. We'll roll it now and let us know what you think you can see down below. It's very difficult to make out entirely, but if you're really looking, and the video does outline it a bit, which helps, you can see a translucent, ghostly figure appearing in the clearing while they're driving. This figure seems formless, almost ethereal in a way, as if it's not even a solid creature. It blends in with the grass so well, it almost seems as if it's part of the scenery or wildlife that's straight up just come to life and sprouted out of the ground. Now, when this clip was posted, commenters were going wild because they thought this could be definitive proof of one of these shape-shifting evil medicine men caught on tape. Now, invisibility, or, being see-through, isn't usually described as being an ability of one of these creatures. I think people might be getting them confused with the Predator from the awesome action movie series. An important distinction to note when we talk about these things is that they're not cryptids per se. And shouldn't be talked about as such or considered like they're a creature or a wild animal, contrary to how it might seem, but rather the legend of these things is that they're shamans and medicine men who have isolated themselves from the rest of the tribe and way of life and are engaging in dark, unholy practices. Now, that's not to say that invisibility is totally impossible. It could be within the realm of these things. I think if you're shape-shifting, theoretically, you could also be turning invisible, but I'm just saying they have enough tricks up their sleeve already. Shape-shifting feels like enough of a cool party trick. You don't need to also add being invisible on that. Your resume's full enough. You got the job. Number 1, the Washington sighting. Now, our next sighting comes to us from Reddit, posted to the Skinwalker subreddit. It's a first-hand account of a Washington local describing what they thought they saw on a camping trip with their partner. The poster describes going camping with her boyfriend, the two of them having significant camping experience. They both grew up in a rural area surrounded by farmland, so they're no stranger to the outdoor. And they decided for a fun, romantic weekend camping trip to go camping about 45 minutes away from Yakima around indigenous territory. They pull up to the lake at about 10:45, and immediately on rolling up, the poster said she got a terrible feeling, like deep in her stomach. She said it wasn't just like kind of a bad feeling about things, but a profoundly bad vibe, saying as if it felt like there was evil radiating deeply throughout her. I personally would turn the car around if that happened to me, but hey, power to you. She realizes as she's looking around the campsite, the reason she feels so strongly about this place is because she's had a dream about it before. It's not just deja vu or something, but something she had seen in her mind's eyes. She tells her boyfriend that she's dreamt this place, everything about it, every little detail, and goes into detail, talking about seeing a pale, creepy face with reflective eyes staring at her through the trees and then running as fast as she could. Pretty scary dream. So they pull up to the campsite eventually. Her boyfriend lights a smoke and they sit around the campfire and soon after start to hear screaming. But she says it doesn't sound like human screaming the way you expect it to. It sounds like someone had distorted and spliced together screams from multiple sources into one, harmonizing perfectly. Now, moments later, this scream appears again, only this time the scream feels even closer. Her boyfriend puts his smoke out and grabs a weapon from their truck, and they wait in the tent for the rest of the night. When they wake up that next morning and check on their site, the cigar had been taken. Now, in some legends, when you hear these creatures far away, when you hear the voice screaming, it means they're closer than you think. So what do you think? Did these two get lucky? Was it just paranoia in the woods setting in? Or did they narrowly avoid being the main characters in the next Blair Witch movie?
Number 5 on this list is the human animal. Yeah, you heard that right, guys. The story that we're dealing with here is of a creature that wasn't quite human, but it also wasn't quite animal either. CVLT Nation says, in July 2004 near Gallup, New Mexico, I had my first and only encounter with a skinwalker. Before this, I used to say, I'll believe it when I see it. Well, I'm a believer now. What I saw was not full human nor full animal. I was moving and had just completed the cleaning and was with my 10-year-old son. We had called it a night and were headed to our new place. As we walked out the front door, I saw a figure move from behind my neighbor's car to a nearby tree that stood between our apartments. It didn't have red glowing eyes, snarling teeth, or a rotten smell. It did move quickly, but not quick enough to avoid the light from a nearby light post and the porch lights. It didn't look at me or come toward me. It moved as if trying to avoid being seen. I was within 15 feet of it, but I did not look back to fully inspect it. What I saw was a wolf-like animal that sort of resembled the Beast in Beauty and the Beast, just not cartoonish. It had brown fur that completely covered it. It wasn't a pelt, it was a very large wolf. It didn't have any human traits except that it walked on its hind legs. It cowered behind the tree as we got into our vehicle. Now let's try to come up with a logical explanation before we buy into the Skinwalker theory, just to rule things out. Could this have been a bear? Well, maybe, but I kind of doubt it considering our friend here refers to it as a wolf-like creature several times. So he definitely didn't get any bear-like qualities from it, okay? So it's not a bear, well, what about being an actual wolf? I mean, this is probably the most possible, except it literally walked on its hind legs. Wolves have been known to get up on their hind legs for a second or two, maybe just to stand on them for a moment, but they don't specifically walk on them. That's not something that happens, guys. This wasn't a wolf, and it wasn't a bear, and it also wasn't a human either. He says it himself. The only really true human characteristics is the fact that it did walk on its hind legs. So it's not a wolf, it's not a bear, it's not a human. What the hell is it? Well, now we're starting to get into Skinwalker territory. I can't really think of any other animal that would have the things he described this one had, other than maybe a skinwalker. Very lucky that the creature didn't attack and he made it out alive. Number 4 on this list is the Grove. So this is a story told by the friend of the person it happened to. CVLT Nation says, I've heard a lot about coyotes and skinwalkers and had a weird experience or two with coyotes. Creepiest was walking up to my sleeping bag being surrounded in paw prints without even hearing them during the night. But never anything paranormal, so to speak. Patrick's story, however, kept me from going back to my favorite backcountry secret stash. He was leaving the area one morning, had been camping there a couple days, and said there was a coyote that always seemed to be close by, like in his peripheral vision, but never overt. He loaded up his truck and started to drive down the wash out to the fire road. At the end of the wash, he could see the coyote following him. When he pulled onto the road, it was running next to him. Now he was freaked out, so he sped up. He said he was going 35 or so, and it was running along beside him. Definitely not possible. When he looked back, the coyote was running on 2 legs and was wearing what Patrick said looked like buckskin pants. An instant later, it was a person wearing a coyote fur keeping pace with his truck. When he looked again, it was gone. We never went back to the Grove after that. Dude, that sounds like something directly out of a fever dream. It was running alongside your car for one, then it was wearing pants, then it was a person wearing pants, and then it was gone? Like literally full-on walking nightmare right there, guys. Also, what is it with these skinwalkers and chasing down cars? We had a few stories in the first part about that as well. I guess they do really just like to run fast. Number 3 on this list is the White Mask. This one is kind of similar to the last one we looked at, but instead of a pale white face, it seemed as if the creature was wearing a white mask. Ranker says, in Hunt for the Skinwalker, George Knapp and Colm Kelleher relay the stories of those who came into contact with skinwalkers near Native American tribal lands. One account from a New Mexico Highway Patrol officer states that while patrolling the highways of New Mexico, he saw a skinwalker on 2 separate occasions. In his first encounter, a creature wearing a white mask appeared next to his window, seemingly attaching itself to the car door. But then he realized it was simply running beside the vehicle, keeping pace at highway speeds. A few days later, and around the same area, he encountered the creature again. What makes this tale even more intriguing is that at least one other officer claimed to have seen the same ghoulish being while patrolling the area. Maybe it was actually a white mask that our friend saw in the previous entry instead of the white face he described. Either way, this one seems dangerous as all holy hell. To be able to run with a car going on the highway? Yeah, that is pretty far from natural, guys. I'd say that considering there were multiple witnesses here, this is probably some of the best proof we have that these creatures are legit.
Number 2, the shopping mall. This next one is a wild one. It's titled Skinwalker at a Shopping Mall. Hey, I guess they want to check out the lush sales sometimes too. I get it, take care of that fur. It starts by saying, I'm a security guard at a gigantic shopping mall with some other guards. I went off to my area while the others went to theirs. I started to do my rounds, going into shop. It was getting kind of close to Halloween and the mall was packed. That's when I noticed him. This cloaked figure coming towards me smoothly. It bumped into me as it passed me and I felt this feeling of fear. I called out to it to see if I'd get a response. I yelled something, I don't know, like stop, right there. It didn't acknowledge that I was there, so I followed it to see where it was going. It stopped and turned slightly to see if it was being followed, then continued down. But the pursuit was cut short by an elderly man falling down in a shop. I went to go help him up. I turned back to where the cloaked figure was walking around, but it wasn't there. It vanished into thin air. I went to have my break, and when I was about to walk through the door, I happened to run into my friend. I asked him, almost as a joke, "Hey, you didn't happen to see a cloaked figure walking around?" He went white and said yeah, and this time it was looking at me. We both sat down and didn't bring it up again for the rest of the shift. When the night shift began, I hopped on the cart, fired up the belt driver, and started doing my round. Then I heard a sound that sounded like laughing. I yelled, "Who's there?" and I shone my light on what looked like the rear end of a grizzly, a gigantic grizzly bear, but its front half looked like a bobcat with red eyes and fangs. "Who's there?" it said in a distorted version of my own voice. I was done. I jumped into the cart and I sped all the way to the entrance of that mall and I ran outside. I've never seen it since that incident. And did you happen to look for a new job or something? Maybe change states, or are you still working at the mall where you know there's probably a skinwalker at? And number 1, I tried to save the best for last with this story posted by user Go Cougar about a skinwalker and their family. You take a listen. I had to snip just a little bit out of this one for timing, but we kept the big beats of it and it's a good story and I'm glad we have it. After graduating high school, Aunt Ani got a job at the grocery store. She started dating a regular and would sneak out at night. It was nothing out of the ordinary until my mom would return home seeing strange items such as tomahawks and animal skulls carved with strange writing and scripture in the backyard. Growing up listening to many stories about witchcraft, skinwalkers, and wendigos like most kids in the res, she immediately became curious about these items. It had become obvious that the relationship wasn't all that it seemed. My mom took one of these skulls to the tribal elder. After examining it, the elder told my mom that the skull was crafted to perform black magic, and the elder was very suspicious. A few days later, Sean and Annie snuck out to the backwoods, but my mom decided to stalk them to see what they were doing. Sean and Annie arrived at an open space in the woods while my mom was hiding in the bushes. They fell into a trance and fell onto the ground screaming and laughing uncontrollably, followed by a sound of bone cracking. They transformed into tall, half deer, half human creatures standing on their back legs. My mom bolted out of the bushes, running back to the trailer to tell the elders everything she saw. A few days later, my mom went to Annie's trailer to pack up and found a note written that said, "I love you. I'm off to a better world." And that was the last Annie was heard from. But 2 months after Annie's disappearance, my mom got woken up by a voice calling her name during an afternoon nap. She immediately recognized the voice. It was Aunt Annie. But when she went outside, she didn't see anyone around except for a deer with a lip and bright green eyes. This deer walked up to my mom and bowed as if it wanted my mom to pet it. My mom believed it was Aunt Annie, her final goodbye. Whew. Number 5, weird deer. Coming up first today on our list of strange sightings is going to be this first clip, which was lovingly uploaded to TikTok with the caption, "WTF deer." Now, of course, we all know what that means, but if you're not familiar with internet acronyms, WTF stands for, well, that's fantastic. And when you see the condition this deer is in, you'll probably say WTF too. In the clip, we can see a deer getting the heck out of Dodge, scampering out of the woods like somebody just flatlined Bambi's mom. It looks frightened, as if it knows something is up. Well, not even a few seconds after we're introduced to our deer, whatever has this deer so scared that it's causing to freeze up like a deer in headlights, a second deer comes running out with a head that's twisted every wrong way. The thing is checking its rear views while also looking forward. The snarled deer then charges forward into the night, hopefully to never be seen again. Now, when this was uploaded, the intent was that this was a skinwalker caught on camera. Skinwalkers, of course, being Dene or Navajo shamans who have been cast out of society for their practice of black magic and unsavory communion with spirits. They're outcasts from society, exiles. And they're traditionally said to be able to take the form of animals if they wish. They're considered witches, not cryptids. And it should be stated too that indigenous people don't particularly enjoy these stories being repackaged. Now in this clip, it seems to me like this is a deer with a bad neck injury, or maybe a manufacturing defect of some kind, struggling to survive. Now while anything on this big blue marble is possible, to me it's more likely this is just a deer who's probably in extreme pain than it is a shape-shifting witch. Personally, if I could shapeshift, I would shapeshift into a deer that had a regular neck. You let me know what you'd shapeshift into. And if you're looking for more footage of shape-shifting animals, creepy crawlers, ghouls and goblins, ghosts, conspiracies, true crime, fake crime, and a whole lot more, Top 5 Scary has all of that and then some. Seriously, if you can think it up, we've got a video or two on it. So click on through, hit subscribe, please make sure to hit that little bell so you don't miss anything. But if you do me a favor, do that at the end of this video, because I got 4 more weird things found in the woods coming up for you right now. Number 4, friendly neighbor. Our next clip is one that maybe you've seen before if you're like me and spend the days trolling the web for supernatural content, as it's a pretty freaky one. Now there's some skepticism all around this script, you know? I'm naturally a bit of a skeptic. I'm more of a Scully than a Mulder. But this next clip is pure weird. We can see someone or something crawling around in the woods. Now it looks human, but isn't that the whole point, to look deceptively human? Well, whatever this humanoid is, we get an up close and personal look at this thing crawling in an extremely comfortable way that doesn't look human. Humanoid moves like a zombie, moving like a puppet with tangled strings. Now, I would think a shapeshifter, if they got caught by someone, would transform into a wolf or a cougar or maybe a hawk and get on out of there, right? And maybe we're catching this creature at a bad time, mid-transformation, as we see the humanoid attempt to build up a bit of momentum by getting down on all fours and trying to accelerate forward. Now, I do feel like I have to address the elephant in the room here. I don't want to talk down to you or play ignorant. Now, this could be a shape-shifting witch of legend, but we should also address the very real possibility that this clip of someone shirtless walking around on all fours behaving extremely odd in what looks to be a backwoods part of Virginia, maybe. This could very easily be someone on substances, or all of the substances, entirely possible by the way that little walk is going. This looks like there is a cocktail of things going on in that head right now. Whether or not this is a supernatural threat or a chemical one, we might not know, but I think we can all agree, completely horrifying, and I would prefer to never have to interact with that person. Number 3, that ain't no book. And coming in right at our sweet little middle spot, here's a clip that I didn't think was the best, but I also didn't think was the worst. It's a perfectly neutral clip, perfect middle child of a clip. In this very short clip, we see someone driving through the backwoods late at night, real children of the corn kind of situation. Nothing but big stalks for miles and miles around, which is perfect actually, all the better for creatures of the night to stalk you in. That pun was a bit laborious, but we got there. In the clip, it seems like the driver notices a buck acting a bit strangely, until the camera zooms in ever so slightly, and you realize immediately, just like the title said, that ain't no buck. We see a bizarre creature on its hind legs running far, far away from the person filming, which I'm sure the person filming wasn't upset about at all. Now this creature looks the most like what I think people imagine a skinwalker looks like when they imagine it. Some wretched mix of flesh and animal skin running through the night hunting for prey. I'm actually not sure what this could be. I mean, it could be somebody again on some substances running through the woods late at night. A lot of these I've always got a possibility for what these creatures could be. I like to think I have a reasonable explanation for everything, but this, I don't know. All I can tell you for sure is that ain't no buck. It's an unexplained sighting caught on camera, after all. You want me to try and explain the unexplained? That's the whole purpose of it. They're unexplained. You simply can't explain them. Number 2, Skinwalker sighting. This was posted to the Skinwalker subreddit. I stumbled upon this forum after my friend had sent me a link a day or two after I had told him my story on the res. The story is 100% true. Whether you believe me or not is up to you. I'm just sharing what had happened to me. This all took place a long time ago when I was much younger. I'm indigenous Mexican and Navajo. The cultural difference is somewhat large. I tend to practice my cultural roots within my Nahua side, but I'm also very close to my native family that resides in the States. My family had planned a trip to Arizona, and we'd made arrangements to stay with some family that lived on that reservation. Though, considering how small dwellings are on the res, my parents thought it would still be a good idea to stay at least a few days and my brother and I would get to go see our cousins. The first day, being the moody teens we were, my cousin and I thought it would be fun to roam the open fields surrounding the res. We were hoping we'd get away from all the noise, and we ended up going off pretty far. Far enough that the houses were out of sight. About halfway back, we noticed a coyote off in the distance. Nothing weird, but we didn't want to get close to it. But that's when it got kind of weird. We heard someone whistling, calling from somewhere around the coyote, but it was something like you'd hear when someone was calling a dog back. It kind of spooked us, so we headed on back. The next day, I started getting headaches. As night rolled around, our parents were out, so my cousins and I played video games for a while until we heard footsteps outside. My brother wanted someone to look out the window with him. I did, and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but then the noises started to come back. And I started to get the most painful headache that I've ever got. I remember crying and feeling so dizzy, never having felt that much pain before. The next day, I saw that same coyote again outside. The same coyote. It was bigger than most I'd seen, and it stared at me unblinking. I heard the same whistling. It had patches of fur missing and looking at me, and it made me feel so sick. I closed and locked the window and left the room. I thought of every mundane possibility. And us natives don't throw around the word skinwalker at every creepy experience. I promise. I just can't find an explanation for why I felt so bad and icky. Honestly, reading that one out loud again still freaked me out. Alright, I saved the best for last for you. Number 1. Our final entry is one last story from user Lisha Ninja to round out our Skinwalker story collection, and honestly, I think it's the spookiest one of the bunch, definitely the most high-octane energy action story. Let me waste no more time introducing and let's get into it. Lisha Ninja writes, "This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her 2 brothers were coming home alone when my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house and, like many people from the res, didn't have electricity. It'd been dark outside for about an hour and my aunt and uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside they heard noises, as if someone moving outside. My uncle went out to the front window and saw someone outside of his truck, which was out of the ordinary to say the least because the closest neighbor was miles away, and my aunt and uncle were frightened. They knew they had to take action. So my uncle took the rifle and readied himself. They flung open the door and aimed at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, unfazed by the drawn long arm. My uncle squeezed the trigger but nothing came out. The figure drew closer and closer and my aunt began to smell the stench of a dead body. It was so strange she started to gag. My uncle continued to pull at the trigger but nothing was coming out and the shadowy figure began to approach. Off in the distance, my grandparents were returning and their headlights shone up the road. This figure looked at the lights and started to move away. My uncle pushed forward to the truck with the rifle drawn. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed at the truck. My grandfather immediately ran inside, grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed it over the gun's barrel. Whatever it was didn't expect this weapon to go off. My grandfather and uncle chased after the creature, and my uncle swears that when the headlights flickered on it, he saw a woman, but running on all fours the way a bear would. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch, it drops about 20 feet. He got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared, and that he knew it was her, and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed away. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, you say their name, and it'll end them. Whew. Number 5. CCTV footage. How on earth did we ever find cryptids and other paranatural beings before we started putting cameras on every street corner and inside everybody's pocket? If for nothing else, I've got to say the surveillance state era has made it way easier to find footage of weird things running around in the dark. Take a look at this extremely creepy footage that we found posted to Reddit. Recorded here is what someone described as a skinwalker caught on camera, and honestly I'm pretty inclined to agree. Let's roll it. Pretty darn creepy, huh? At first glance, you would totally be forgiven for thinking that's a demon or a dog monster. And it's only when you brave up and look through the cracks in your fingers, you're willing to take another look, you realize what you're watching is a human being running by on all fours, like perfectly like an animal. Whoever this is running on all fours better than I run on twos. This is one of the freakiest things I've seen in a good while, and I literally exclusively watch freaky content online all day, every day for my job, so it stands out. This one actually made me like recoil. I've never seen a human being move like that. Well, allegedly a human. That's why we're including it in this video. Could this be a human? Or is this another being altogether? Some powerful shapeshifter caught mid-transformation, dashing through a Walmart parking lot at 2 in the morning? Now, there's not much information to be found about this, but I still did my digging for you just because I care. From what I could garner and gather, the footage was recorded in Mexico a few years back at the start of 2020, and a few Redditors who were helping me out said that apparently it was a little bit of like a national meme. So if we have any Mexican viewers out there who can confirm or deny this and saw this footage and started laughing, I would love to hear from you about it, because I do want to get to the bottom of one of the weirdest things I've seen in a minute. Prank, hoax, real deal or not, I don't really know about that, but what I can guarantee you is that whatever it is genuinely terrifying. And if you're looking for loads more scary content of shapeshifters or all things paranatural, well, I like to think Top 5 Scary is the #1 place to be. We've got our fingers in a little bit of everything scary on the globe, so click through, find something to shriek at or fall asleep to, I'm not judging. Subscribe and stay scared, but finish this video first before you click away. We got more Skinwalker scares coming up for you. Number 4, stray dogs. So for most of these, I found some stories from people on Reddit who claimed that they had experiences with skinwalkers, and all of them are really cool stuff, so I thought I'd share them along with you. Our first one coming up is going to be someone who says this was a family experience they had. This happened to their brother, and I've paraphrased it ever so slightly for content guidelines, but the story at large is mostly the same. In 2015, my brother worked for a security guard hiring place. I don't really know what you'd call it. Basically, he would call and they would station him someplace or another that needed it. So this particular time, my brother got hired by a local cemetery, as they'd had issues with people sneaking in, going so far as to even break a couple graves. No good? Anyways, his job was to drive around the cemetery and make sure no one was messing around. And this area was pretty rural and had a stray dog problem. Dogs would get lost, or people would abandon them and they would roam the countryside. One night, my brother was stationed at the cemetery and he noticed a big pack of dogs, around 8 or so. He said it was a good assortment, including a tiny little Bichon Frise that had the harness still on and a big old Rottweiler. My brother is driving around real slow and he has the window down when he hears the dogs going wild. And then he hears a sound he described as sounding like that screaming bird from the swamp episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Quick little aside, Taylor again. I hope that's a great frame of reference for you guys, because I've never seen that show, so I got no idea. Okay, story time again. He says he sees something fast and pale running in front of the headlights and the dogs all start freaking out again. So he follows the dogs in fear that they're going to tear something up. He parks his car and he hears a faint call for help. He shines his light and he sees that the dogs have chased the deer, except the deer was pale, gray, and emaciated. No antlers, and its eyes were completely pitch black. The Rottweiler tried to jump the deer but was thrown off. The creature screeched and then ran into the night on all fours. He never worked for that company again. Bone chiller, eh? What do you guys think? Too good to be true, or too true to be good? Number 3. Our next story comes to us from a website called darkstories.org. Let me tell you, there's some dark stories on here, but it was a fascinating little walk to go through. Let's take a look at our first one. The user writes, about almost a year ago, I used to live in a somewhat isolated neighborhood that was in the high desert of California. I lived in a dirt road, and since the homes were so proud out, wildlife wasn't an uncommon thing. You'd see rabbits, coyotes, snakes, and on rare occurrences sometimes deer. But once you lived out there for a while, you got used to animals roaming around during the late hours. I'm indigenous, so most of the time I actually enjoy seeing wildlife close to my home. But I have always known of a creature my tribe refers to as the Skinwalker. And I'm not supposed to say that word, but it was typed, so hopefully there's no bad omen. Hey, is it fine if I say it? Can we look into that? Can we get somebody on that? Okay, back to it. The house I lived in had a very large backyard and gravel mixed with dirt driveway, leaving a lot of open space to look out from. My room was at the front of the house, and every night if I had my window open, I'd find myself staring out at the front gate of our driveway. It was quiet every night, unless you heard coyote howls. There was a lot of strange things up there. At the time I was homeschooled, and I was sitting in the office in silence doing my work. In the silence I heard a knock by the window that I couldn't see out of. I couldn't see through because we didn't have blinds or curtain, we had sliding doors as windows instead. So I turned my head to look at the window and it went silent. But then I thought I heard someone or something walking. Months later I changed rooms with the office and I was looking out that same window that I heard those footsteps, except it was night. I saw a figure on the side of the gate that looked like it was a coyote, but it was too long. And the way it was moving looked like it was something that wasn't from this world, as if it was a human trying to imitate a dog. It stood there as still as a statue until it stood up and tried to climb over the gate. I shut the barn door and I heard it running before I closed the gate. And that was the last time I ever kept my windows open at night. Honestly, probably good advice. A little bit of cold air is not worth that.
Number 2 on this list is No Ordinary Girl. This is a story, as you may have guessed, about a girl that probably wasn't a girl. Ranker says the tale of terror comes all the way from Australia. While walking her dogs out in the Australian bush, a woman encountered a fearful sight. She was enjoying the trail when suddenly her 2 dogs started barking uncontrollably and becoming extremely agitated. Soon she saw what appeared to be a small female child no older than 7. The child had her back to the woman, who was only a bit startled at first, as she believed the child was just part of a camping party. However, when the girl turned around, her eyes were lifeless and entirely black. Before the woman could make a break for it, the creature let out an ear-splitting howl and ran off into the bush, never to be seen again. She was left wondering if the child she saw was someone pulling a prank on her, or if it really was a shape-shifting skinwalker. She may never know. Maybe the scariest part about this one is that if this story is true, it means skinwalkers can be found outside of America. Conventional wisdom has kind of said that these creatures are only in North America, but that might not be true. If they're all the way in Australia, then they could literally be anywhere. Hopefully it was just a prank, but based on the circumstances, I kinda doubt it. And finally, number 1 on this list is The 6 Men. This is another story about how some type of beasts were able to keep up with a car. Ranker says, my friend's mission region had a reservation within its boundaries. However, it was relatively far from where he was serving. On one occasion, him and his mission companion were asked to travel further than usual to meet some investigators. This took them near the reservation. On their way home, their car ran out of gas, and it wasn't until late at night that they were able to continue the journey home. My friend chose a different route that took him through some back roads in an attempt to get home sooner. He told us he was driving above the speed limit when he noticed movement in the woods lining the road. Because coyotes were common in the area, he took little notice at first. Then he looked out the window and slammed on the brakes. The sudden stop jolted his companion awake, who immediately wanted to know what was wrong. My friend was shaken, and he said he would tell him once they got home. He asked him to say a prayer. By the time they made it home, his companion was dying to know what had happened. My friend told him, I looked down at the road next to the car and saw 6 men running on all 4s, keeping up with the car. I was driving 40 miles an hour. 6 dudes on all 4s keeping up with a car going 40 miles an hour. Usain Bolt, the fastest man of our generation, in his best race ever, reached a top speed of 27.33 miles per hour. That's the fastest man in the world, running the fastest he's ever run on 2 legs, and he still doesn't come close to touching what the car was doing. One thing is definitely clear from doing this video, guys. Skinwalkers, if they are real, are clearly fast as hell. And if one decides that it wants to target you, I don't know if you're gonna be able to escape.
Number 5, weird goat. Coming up first on our list of unsettling skinwalker encounters is this strange footage that's been making the rounds around TikTok, and understandably why when you see, how weird this is. Take a quick look for me. It looks like a cute little goat at first. As cute as a goat can be, no goat hate. Until it gets up close to the front door and stares, there's just something off about this thing, Goats are kind of weird looking as is, but this one looks like it's got a secret behind its eyes, or it's giving you that look where it's asking you if you have any games on your phone. It just looks wrong, in that indescribable uncanny valley way. Especially as it's shown when the video cuts back again and we see the goat's almost got like dog looking eyes. It certainly does not look like any goat that I have ever seen, that's for certain. Now, I couldn't tell you if this is a skinwalker in disguise wearing a goat costume, or just a goat being particularly bizarre, which is not entirely unheard of. Goats are considered one of the more demonic animals. They're very commonly associated with Satan and Lucifer and all sorts of hellish manners. It's said that skinwalkers are Dene witches who have gone against the natural order of things and use powerful magic to be able to take the form of any animal that they so please. As some local legends say that a way to suss out a skinwalker is through their eyes, being able to see them shine differently than normal. That would certainly explain what's going on with this goat's bizarre eyes, and unless there's any goat experts out there in the comments that can help me out with this one, I'm really not sure what we're looking at besides something terrifying. And if you're looking for more terrifying stories about skinwalkers, cryptids, aliens, really just about anything scary under the sun, Top 5 Scary has all of that and then some. So click through, find something to like, stay subscribed, stay scared, but please, keep watching this video. We did work pretty hard on it. Alright. Back to it. We got way more Skinwalker stories for you coming up. Number 4, Idaho. Now, Idaho is pretty well known in the paranormal community as being a place where a lot of strange stuff is going on. It's no Ohio, but it's up there as far as scary states go. Our first freaky story is gonna come to us from a Redditor, Chuck Wool, sharing their story on the Skinwalker subreddit. Here we go. Listen to this. It was mid-November 2021 and me and a bunch of friends were camping in the woods in the Sawtooth National Forest near Petite Lake. There were 2 groups of people in 2 tents and 1 in a car, and my buddy and I in hammocks near the edge of the camp. It's about 1 a.m. and we had all been sleeping for about 2 hours. I wake up to my hammock mate panting extremely heavily and yelling my name, and I'm a bit confused and I get up and help him. He's paralyzed by fear. He said that he had extremely vivid dreams, that there was a tall and slender, all black figure trying to break into his car after he'd seen the figure take my head off and the rest of our friends. Normal everyday fun campfire dreams under the stars kind of deal. He said that he woke up and he swore he saw the figure near the car and that he saw all of our heads on sticks. I was obviously pretty freaked out at this point, as I think most people would be, and I immediately felt very uneasy. I told him it was just a bad dream and that he should go back to sleep. One of our buddies yells, proceeding to wake up most of the camp, and we find that our friend in the car that my buddy said clicked the car alarm. So all of us, scared and awake now, have a conversation about what is going on. And my friend in the car says that he heard something scratching on the window and said that he saw a slender black figure running around the car. And the next morning we all talked about what had happened. And 6 of them all had similar nightmares describing similar things. Tall, slender black figures, heads on pikes, the whole scary 9 yards. We had friends that had stayed at the same site 6 months earlier, and a few of them felt like they were being watched. There are strange things afoot in the Idaho mountains. So what do we think, my top 5 scary gang? Skinwalkers? Witches? Slender Man? Or just something in the coffee? Number 3, Iowa sighting. Our next story comes to us from Reddit once again, from the subreddit r/true scary stories. Not to imply the other stories we've been sharing are fake, just that these ones are definitely real. And quick shout out for the Reddit scary horror story community as a whole, putting all these campfire stories in one beautiful digital archive. Coming to us from a user, a Weird Doggo 64, love that name. They write, as a native, I think me and my mother had a close call with a skinwalker. Now this story I had to trim just the tiniest little bit for timing purposes, so it's paraphrased ever so slightly, but the story has been mostly left intact. My family has lived in Iowa since July of 2017, and we live in a small neighborhood with a minimum of maybe 25 houses, and it's surrounded by forestry. I've seen a bunch of horror movies over the years, so I get pretty paranoid. A year into living there, we get a new dog, and we named him Tucker. He's an energetic little guy with everybody. Now a couple years later, my mom and dad get divorced, and she moved on to a guy that lives a couple miles away from the house. My mom and dad settled on a pretty good schedule for when they could spend the day with us. Now my mom's side is my native side, and we do believe in the lore of skinwalkers. One day, it's my mom's turn to look after us. She's driving up this road surrounded by a bunch of trees and farms. There's a hill on this road, and as my mom drove up the hill, she saw something in a field that she described as being tall, gray-skinned, and had hooves for feet, and it was walking into the woods. Well, when she reached to a stop sign, she looked back in her mirror and nothing. Now my mom was terrified because she remembered the stories of skinwalkers she would hear as a girl. A couple days later, it was nighttime, and my dog had to go outside to the bathroom. I put him on a leash that's connected to the porch. I turned on a light that was outside so I could see where he was going, and I heard him barking. I walked towards the door and I told him to get in, and I look into the darkness to see nothing but eyes shining from the porch light. I pulled him in and I slammed the door as soon as he got outside. I covered every window in the house. It's been 2 months since then, and my routine when it gets dark was what I did when I saw those eyes. I closed the blinds, I locked the doors, and I turn off the lights. Something creeping in the dark? Raccoons? Skinwalkers? What do you think?
Number 2 on this list is Yanal Delushi. A terrifying tale where a young boy was almost taken far too soon. CVLT Nation says, one year when I was in grade school, we went to visit her. Most of the visits were pretty uneventful, typical boring old people stuff, except she always kept her curtains drawn shut and would always peek out the window, and when someone asked what she was doing, she would simply reply, "You know, Lucy is watching me." This went on for nearly the entire visit until a few days before we were due to leave. My grandma and my baby brother were in the front yard that evening planting flowers when all of a sudden my grandmother starts shouting, "Get away from that creature. It's not safe." Of course, being in Nevada, we all assumed that my brother had found a scorpion or a rattlesnake, so we all run inside to see my grandmother clutching my little brother and shaking in terror against the side of the house. Standing out in the yard was a large, black, Great Dane sized dog. It was staring at my grandmother with an intensity I'd never seen before. It looked up at us, gave a little huff, and bounded off. I don't remember if it moved unusually fast or not, but do remember it had really deep yellow eyes. When my mother asked my grandmother what had happened, she kept repeating, "The Yenald Lucy has found me." She moved a couple weeks after that. So I imagine that the Yenald Lucy is a special skinwalker that apparently this grandmother knew about. I obviously don't know all the old tales and don't have the same wisdom that she has, but this creature sounds especially bad. As if there was some history between it and the grandmother and it was coming to exact revenge. Very lucky that the young boy was able to make it out of there alive. And finally, number 1 on this list is the Ruins of Inquisition. Bit of a creepy name there already, guys. Kinda sounds like a mission in Skyrim or something like that, and I guess based on what happens, it could be. 5 years ago, some friends went out to some ruins in New Mexico. These ruins were critical during the actual Inquisition, hence the name. Well, once they got there, one of the friends started playing on the flute that they brought. They were only 30 seconds into playing the thing when a blood-curdling scream filled the air. It was so loud it almost burst the eardrums off of these guys. Then as the scream was happening, a creature was jumping and running across the tops of the ruins. It was moving so fast that they couldn't even really make out what it was. They thought it was an animal of some type though, but obviously nothing natural. The guys noped on out of there as fast as possible and drove 6 hours in the other direction. What's even crazier though is that when they got to their next destination, which was a campsite, and after they set up their campsite, they came face to face with what they thought was the creature from the ruins. 7 to 10 feet tall, a werewolf human-like creature was staring directly at the guys from the deep darkness. They then ran as fast as they could and noped the hell out of that place too. This time they all went home and just prayed that they weren't followed. But crazy, absolutely crazy to think that they were tracked and followed 6 hours. Only creature that could have done that, in my opinion, is a skinwalker.